Thank you for choosing this video training course, MS-100 Microsoft 365 Identity and Services. Recently, Microsoft retooled their certification exams, moving the focus from specific technologies to organizational roles. The MS-100 exam focuses on the role of Microsoft 365 Enterprise Administrator, which is someone who participates in every aspect of evaluating, planning, migrating, deploying, and managing Microsoft 365 services. This course is intended both to cover many of the responsibilities of the Enterprise Administrator role and to help you prepare for the MS-100 exam. It consists of a series of lessons that guide you through the exam objectives. Each lesson is a combination of discussion and demonstrations of the relevant tools and activities. I've been a Microsoft certified trainer for more than 20 years. I got my start in technology as a sysadmin, and now I spend quite a lot of time working with Microsoft Cloud technologies, both as a trainer and as a technology consultant, working with various private clients. This course contains 4 lessons, each of which is broken down into learning objectives of varying lengths. The lessons are organized in such a way as to easily map to the exam objectives. In Lesson 1, Design and Implement Microsoft 365 Services, we'll cover the process of planning and deploying a Microsoft 365 tenant. In Lesson 2, Manage User Identity and Roles, we'll focus on the options that are available to you to deploy and manage a cloud-based identity solution for your Microsoft 365 tenancy. In Lesson 3, Manage Access and Authentication, we'll discuss some of the fundamentals of securing your Microsoft 365 tenancy. And in Lesson 4, Plan Office 365 Workloads and Applications, we'll discuss configuration and deployment of some of the more common Microsoft 365 applications such as Teams, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and the Power Platform. By the end of the course, you should have a solid grasp of what the Enterprise Administrator's job is with regard to setting up a tenant, deploying and securing an identity management solution, and deploying some of the common Microsoft 365 applications. And you should have the fundamentals you need to prepare for and pass the MS-100 exam. I hope you get as much out of taking the course as I did writing and recording it. In Lesson 1, we'll talk about designing and implementing Microsoft 365 services. The primary focus of this lesson is to discuss what's involved in the planning and design phase of rolling out a new Microsoft 365 deployment. While it's true that Microsoft 365 makes it easy to start rolling out apps and deploying new functionality, for most organizations you'll get a lot more value out of your Microsoft 365 tenant if you start by planning your deployment and putting some basic management practices in place before you begin your rollout. In this lesson, we're going to start with a general discussion of planning your architecture, including some of the questions you'll want to ask and the data you'll want to collect about your existing infrastructure, followed by a discussion and demonstrations of deploying a new Microsoft 365 tenant, including the basic process of setting up a tenant, doing some initial configuration, and getting support from a Microsoft partner. From there, we'll talk about some basic management topics, including setting up monitoring of your new tenant, and we'll finish the lesson with a discussion of planning for migration of your existing users and their data. Let's get started. A quick definition before we get started. Throughout the course, we're going to be using the term Microsoft 365 services. That term in general refers to things like Office Online, Exchange, Teams, Word Online, Excel Online, in other words, all of the cloud-based components of Microsoft 365, whether or not they have client-side analogs. First thing we're going to talk about is planning your architecture. The high-level steps for planning your architecture include determining your deployment goals, inventorying your current environment and making key deployment decisions, fixing potential deployment blockers, setting up Microsoft 365 services to work for your organization, and then rolling it out to the users. Here's some things to think about when you're determining your deployment goals. First off, what's the scope of your deployment? Are you deploying to everyone in the organization, to a single department, a single physical plant? Are you replacing your entire IT infrastructure or just parts of it? Next, what's the timeline of the deployment, and is it rational? Does it make sense? Will you track the progress using some kind of technology like a project? Will you just use an Excel spreadsheet? Will you do it in SharePoint, something else? And what are the criteria for success? What allows you to declare victory? Once you've identified your goals, the first thing you're going to need to do is inventory your current environment and decide how that's going to impact your deployment. For example, what user accounts do you have? Which ones are going to get migrated? Is it all of them? Is it only some of them? Will some of them get discarded? Is there replication necessary? Also, same questions about mailboxes. What mailboxes are remaining on-prem versus getting migrated to the cloud? What software and operating systems do you have on-prem? This could be a very big part of the deployment because you may have things that aren't going to migrate cleanly or at all, and you're going to need to figure out alternatives. Also, what are the current network settings? Going to Microsoft 365, unsurprisingly, has profound impacts on an organization's network usage. Usually bandwidth requirements go up, and of course everyone needs to have uniform access to the internet. Also, what do you have for file storage on-prem, and are you going to migrate some of that, all of that, none of it? What corporate applications are in place? Are there any custom applications, for example? Is there a corporate intranet? Any messaging applications, CRM, ERP, and so forth? Of course, lots of things can go wrong with any deployment, but a number of common sense steps include things like cleaning up Active Directory accounts. For example, the rules for on-prem Active Directory are slightly different from the ones for Azure AD. So you should use a tool like ID Fix, for example, to audit your on-prem user directory. We'll have a demo of that a little bit later in the course. Next, get your data ready. In most organizations, it's very common to keep a lot of data around that you don't need anymore. And of course, it might still make sense to just migrate it all and sort it out later. But to the extent that you can, audit everything, eliminate things that just don't make any sense to ship into the cloud, and also make sure that you're okay with regulatory requirements and things like that. Next, prepare the network for migration. There are a number of requirements for Microsoft 365. The table at the right shows, for example, the port requirements that you need to have open for various services. And it's not rocket science, but it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're getting ready to migrate. And update any on-prem software. Of course, some software may have known incompatibilities with Microsoft 365, so make sure that you have versions of all of your current software that you are pretty confident are going to work. Okay, so you've done all that. You've done all your planning, you've fixed all your deployment blockers, and you've set up Microsoft 365. Now what? So the first things you're going to do are, for example, verify your domains. Make sure that whatever domains you want to use with your Microsoft 365 subscriptions are valid, that you've got them set up, and that you're ready to configure them for Microsoft 365. Then configure your application settings. So for example, on-prem email clients, instant messaging clients, online meetings, things like that. Get them all ready for cutting over to Microsoft 365. If you're going to do directory synchronization or single sign-on, prepare for that. Also, make sure your help desk is aware of the changes. Get them used to working with Microsoft 365. Make sure they're set up with the appropriate permissions. And then test your deployment and migration. So in other words, you've got your subscription online. Now, pick a test group, presumably you already have, and just start making sure that all of the migration is going to work the way you expect it to. And make sure your users have been educated about whatever changes are coming up. And having done all that preparation, you're now ready to roll out to your users. We're going to talk about a lot of these steps in more detail later in the course, but at a high level, you're going to start by adding your users to Azure Active Directory and assigning the appropriate licenses to them. Migrate all the user data into the cloud. Conduct validation testing, make sure that everything is working okay. Cut over your DNS to point to Microsoft 365. Let the users know that they can start using Microsoft 365, and then reconfigure all your client software, for example, your email clients, to start using Microsoft 365. A couple of other things to plan for are identity and authentication and enterprise application modernization. This is something that we'll talk about a great deal more later in the course, but planning an identity and authentication solution might include setting up directory synchronization, configuring Azure AD Connect, configuring Azure AD Connect pass-through, configuring an ADFS deployment, setting up Active Directory Federation services in Microsoft Azure, or configuring Azure Active Directory seamless single sign-on. And the term enterprise application modernization just generally refers to making sure that all of your applications are ready to go for Microsoft 365. So these might include things like analyzing device and app readiness. In other words, making sure that all the devices and apps that you have in your enterprise are ready to work with Microsoft 365. Make sure your directory and network are ready as well. Deploying Office and Business apps where there are gaps. Migrating all your user files and settings into the new applications. setting up security and compliance configuration to match whatever your organizational requirements are, and of course, deploying and upgrading and migrating any OSs that aren't compatible with the current version of Microsoft 365. In this section, we're going to look at the process of deploying a Microsoft 365 tenant. And a tenant is a unique instance of Microsoft 365, which is configured for use by your organization specifically, running on shared hardware in the Azure data centers. To set one up, you start by choosing the subscription that you want to use, identify any security and mobility components that'll be used, and then plan your migration of your data. The first thing to do when setting up a new tenant is to choose the subscription that you're going to use. You could go with a Microsoft 365 Business subscription, Basic or Standard or Premium, or an Enterprise subscription, an E3 or an E5, or an F3, which is First-Line Workers, which is a more cut down and less expensive version of the Enterprise subscription. Also, if you're an educational organization or a government organization, there may be special licensing available for you. And the question that comes up a lot when you're choosing a subscription is, how do I know which subscription to go with? So there are a number of considerations. For example, why is your organization moving to Microsoft 365? What services do you want to use? What are you hoping to accomplish? Different subscriptions, of course, provide access to different sets of services. Also, what's your organization's current IT infrastructure? In other words, what are you looking to replace or upgrade? Also, what's your organization's change management process? It may be important to consider, for example, what your intake for new users is or how you deploy new applications. And how many employees are going to use Microsoft 365? Among other things, you may choose different sets of subscriptions for different types of employees. And finally, what are your organization's plans for growth? The business subscriptions, for example, cap the number of users that you can license, which means that if you intend to grow beyond the number of licenses that are available to you, it may make more sense to go with a more advanced subscription. Now I'm going to show you how to create a new Microsoft 365 subscription. There are a number of ways to go at this. I'm going at it from the product comparison page, and I'm going to do an E5 subscription. So I'm going to say buy now, and then enter an email address. In this case, I'm using an address that hasn't already been set up. If you use an address that's already associated with a Microsoft 365 tenant, it'll ask if you want to use that one, but you can still just set up a separate account. So I'm going to say set up account and then fill in some basic information about myself. And then click next. Next, it wants to text me to make sure that this is legit. So I'll fill in my verification code here. Next, it wants to know how I'm going to sign in. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is create a temporary domain name. Its suggested one, contoso566.onmicrosoft.com. I'm going to change this and leave my default username the way that it is and add a password. And click Next. Next up is payment information. So now it wants to know how many licenses I want to buy. For the sake of this demo, I'm going to select one, but you can see I can pick as many as I want. And add a payment method. This is just a regular credit card. And once that's done, I can click Place Order, which starts my subscription. And now I'll get started. This now brings me to a little miniature setup process here. All of this stuff is stuff you can do later. So for example, I'm going to wait until later to install Office. I'm going to wait until later to change my domain. I'll say, yes, I like the setup process and submit. And then go to the admin center. And from here, I can continue setting up my tenant. Having chosen a subscription, you'll need to identify what security and mobility components you want. Azure AD is kind of de rigueur. You're going to need it because it provides identity for everything in Microsoft 365. But you might also want to use Azure Identity Protection, which automates the detection of identity-based risks and collects risk data for later investigation in the portal. lets you export risk detection data to your security information and event management solution. And then you might also want Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. This, as it says, might require additional purchase, but this is going to provide you with additional abilities to manage, control, and monitor access to important resources in your organization. Also, Azure Information Protection, which provides you with labels. It allows you to discover and classify and protect documents and emails by applying labels to your content. And you may also want to use Microsoft Intune, which focuses on mobile device management and mobile application management. So when you create a new Microsoft 365 tenancy, you get a default domain. The default domain is always something.onmicrosoft.com. But you can, and usually will want to, configure a custom domain. And this can be a domain that you own, or it can be purchased via GoDaddy directly via the portal. And we're going to take a look at a demo of configuring a custom domain right now. Now I'm going to show you how to configure a custom domain. So I'm here in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and I'm going to start by going to Show All and expand Settings and select Domains. Currently, you can just see my default domain, and now I want to add a new one. And in this case, I'm going to add a domain that I already own. So I'm going to say, I want to use this domain. And since I already own it, I now need to demonstrate that I actually own it. And that means that I need to do something to its DNS records. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a text record to the domain's DNS records. Here's the text record I'm going to add. It has to have a name of @, and this is the value. I'm going to copy this. And now I'll hop over to my registrar, which in this case you can see is my hosting provider is Bluehost. Obviously, Microsoft has detected this, but it can be any valid hosting provider. Okay, here I am at Bluehost, and I'm already in the DNS management for my domain. I'm going to go and find the text record section now and say I want to add a record. This, of course, is specific to the interface in Bluehost, but your experience will be similar to this. Okay, there we go. My text record has been added. And now I'm back over here in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and I'm going to click Verify. And as you can see, I initially get an error. We didn't detect that you added this new record to MS-100 demo.site. That's not surprising. It usually takes a while for these things to propagate through the DNS. So now I need to wait a bit. Now I've waited a while, so I'm going to try again. And there we go. Now, how do you want to connect to your domain? I'm going to add my own record, so I'll continue here. And now I do want to set up DNS for Exchange, and that means that I need to add some records. So first, I need an MX record. And this, as you can see, actually points to Outlook protection. So this is going to provide me with spam protection for my domain, conveniently enough. So back over here at Bluehost, we'll add that in. Okay, next thing I need is a CNAME record to allow auto-discover. This is to allow auto-configuration of certain clients like Outlook. And last thing I need is a text record. This is for spoofing protection. And now I can continue. And just like earlier, it doesn't get detected right away, so I need to wait a bit longer. Okay, some time has passed, so we'll try this again. And there it is. My domain is configured. Yes, it was easy. And just cancel that and say done. And there it is. I now have a domain configured for my tenant. The next thing I can do now is go and configure user email. So I'm going to go to my active users, and I'm going to configure the email for this user here, Megan Bowen. As you can see right now, Megan's username and email uses the default domain, so I'm going to change that. And I'm just going to edit her primary and just switch it to use MS-100 demo.site. and save the changes. And there it is. She is now Megan at ms100demo.site. Now, just to demonstrate that this is true, I'm going to sign into Office in an in-private session, and I'm going to try signing in as Megan. As you can see, that's her username. And I'll send a quick message to myself using Megan's email. And back here, signed in as the admin. Here's that test email. And if we check Megan, you can see that she is, in fact, Megan B at ms100demo.site. So both her username and her email address have been changed now to use my custom domain. Now that we've configured our custom domain, I'm going to show you how to bulk update all of your users with the new domain information. As we've already seen, it's possible to manually update your users using the user interface here. For example, I clicked on Megan, went and managed username and email, and you can edit it here. But that, of course, would be tedious if you had to do it for all of your users. So what I'm going to show you instead is how to do it using PowerShell. So here in PowerShell, I have a script that I'm going to use to do the bulk update. And this is a pretty simple script. It's not the only way of doing this for sure, but I want to point out a couple of things. The first thing is that, as you can see, I need to use the Exchange Online Management module. And then I also need to use the Azure AD module because I'm actually doing two different things. I'm updating both the email address and the user ID. The Azure AD module is already installed on my machine, so I don't need to import it. In any event, so you can see I'm switching from the old domain to the new domain. I have to sign into both services, and then I'm just going to loop through all the mailboxes in the, in the current Exchange tenant that have the old domain, and use that information to update both the mailbox using set mailbox and the user identity using set Azure AD user. So I'll go ahead and run it now. As you can see, it needs me to sign in, so I'll enter my password here. Does a little bit of configuration. And then, as you can see, processes all of my users. Okay, my script is done. And now back here in the admin center, if I go and refresh this, you can see that sure enough, all of my active users have now been updated. And if I go and check out Alex Wilbur here, for example, you can see that he has the ms100demo.site configured for his primary email address and username. And by default, he still retains the old domain name as an alias so that, email and login will still work. After doing the initial configuration of your tenant, there are a number of next steps you might consider. These include configuring basic organizational settings and configuring tenant-wide service settings. There are dozens of organizational settings available to configure, and they fall into several categories. First, the services category, which is just sort of the global settings for the various apps and services. This is forever growing and changing. The security and privacy category, which is global security policies, and the organization profile, which is just general information about your organization, branding on your portal, support information, and so forth. To look at some of the details here under the services page, common settings include things like setting up mail auditing and mail flow rules, changing users' calendar sharing settings, and controlling the defaults for Edge and for the Bing homepage. Note that there are dozens more settings here, and you may not want to set most of them, but it's a good idea to just sort of look over the page and see what's available. Next, in the security and privacy category, settings that you might want to look at include things like the password expiration policy, and privileged access, which is where you can provide temporary admin permissions to non-admins for specific applications. And the customer lockbox, which says that Microsoft isn't allowed to access your content even when they need to do service without getting your explicit approval. And the organization profile, as I said, is just where you set things up about your organization. So this is things like general information about your organization, any custom themes you want to set up for your Microsoft 365 portal, and release preferences, which governs how applications are going to be released to your various users. The organizational profile is just the basic information about your organization. It includes things like locations, contact info, and it also allows you to customize the user experience. And we're going to take a look at a demo of configuring it right now. Let's take a look at entering organization information. This is typically one of the early things you'll do after you've configured your tenant. Here in the admin center, I'm going to say show all and go to settings and org settings. This is, of course, where you can set a lot of different things about your tenancy. And one of the first things you'll typically do is go to organization profile, go to organization information, and just fill in the basics about your organization. Okay, and once all the information is filled in, I just click Save. And that's now my organization information. Now I want to show you how to configure release preferences. Back here in the Admin Center, I'm going to Show All and go to Settings, to Org Settings, and select the Organization Profile and select Release Preferences. This is going to allow me to configure certain users to receive new features up to 6 months before general release. So, for example, if I say targeted release for select users and save, then I get to pick the users that I want to assign it to, and I can say, for example, my user named Megan is a QA user, and so I want her to receive those things before everybody else. She's now been configured, and I now have release preferences configured for my organization. Another really important setup task is configuring tenant-wide workload settings, of which there are a lot, and some things are going to be configured directly from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and a lot of things are going to be from the dedicated admin centers for the specific applications, sometimes both. Now I'm going to show you how to configure Teams tenant-wide. Back here in the Admin Center, I'll say Show All, expand Settings, and go to Org Settings. And the services page here gives me high-level configuration of a lot of different services throughout my enterprise, including Microsoft Teams. Now, as you can see on the Teams blade here, there's not a lot that I can actually configure from here. I can turn it on and off. I can allow guest access. That's about it. Anything beyond that, and I need to go to the Teams Admin Center. And then, of course, from here, I can configure everything about Teams. I can manage my teams, change the settings, and so forth. Now you're going to want to figure out how to get support with your Microsoft 365 tenant. This is going to include finding Microsoft partners to work with and working with Microsoft Fast Track. A really neat feature of Microsoft 365 is that support from external partners is built right in. As a global admin or billing admin, you can go to the admin portal and go and select partner relationships, find a partner that meets the criteria that you want, get an invite from them, and then once you've received it, accept the terms in the invite. They get added to your admin portal, and then you can delegate administration to the partner. There are a number of roles that you can delegate. For example, they could be a reseller, someone that sells Microsoft products to your organization, a delegated administrator, which allows them to perform administrative operations in your tenant, a reseller and delegated administrator, and so forth. Fast Track is another support option that's available to Microsoft 365 customers. It's a combination of tools and resources and live support from Microsoft and Microsoft partners to help you with your deployment. And your specific resources are tied to your seat count. So everybody gets access to the digital resources. If you have at least 150 seats, you also have access to Fast Track engineers or approved Fast Track partners. And if you have at least 500 seats, then you can also access the data migration support option. To sign up for Fast Track, you just go to the URL that you see at the top of the slide there, sign in with your Microsoft 365 account, and fill in the form. And your request is usually approved immediately, and then you get your Fast Track dashboard with all of your available resources. The next topic is managing Microsoft 365 subscription and tenant health. As an admin, you're going to want to create an internal service health response plan. And specific to your organization, there are a number of paths you might choose. For example, you might just use the Microsoft 365 admin app, which allows admins to monitor the status of various services from a mobile device. You can see service health information, maintenance status updates, and lots more. You might also use the System Center Operations Manager Office 365 Management Pack, which includes sections on things like subscription health, service status, active incidents, resolved incidents, and the Message Center. You might also make a custom application that makes direct use of the Office 365 Service Communications API, which gives you real-time information about all the services, Message Center communications, and more. To monitor the health of Microsoft 365 services, you can use the Service Health Dashboard at the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It gives you a comprehensive overview of all of the services. Service by service, you can check on the status of each service and its current health and any advisories. And you can also ask to receive emails when something goes wrong. And we're going to take a look at a demo of that right now. Let's take a look at managing service health alerts. Here in the Admin Center, when I expand Show All, I've got a category called Health. And in the Health category, I can go to the Service Health page, and this is where I'm going to see information about my service health. Now, since I just provisioned my tenant, of course, I don't really have anything going on here. But I usually will want to be advised when something happens. So what I can do is click on Customize here, go and pick which services I want to see health information for, and I can also configure email and say that I want to receive email notifications about the service health. So I'll add my email address here and say that I want to get information about everything, about incidents, about advisories, incidents, things that have actually happened, advisories, things that I might want to know about, and I can pick the services that I want to receive information about. I'll save this, and then I'll wait, you can see, up to 8 hours for these changes to take effect. In order to use Microsoft 365 services, users need licenses. The licenses are all managed via Azure Active Directory, and you can see individual user licenses directly in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, but you can also view them via the Licenses blade in the Azure AD portal. You can also use PowerShell. PowerShell provides some really nice interfaces to monitoring all kinds of information about Microsoft 365 and Azure AD. For example, the get MSOL user commandlet returns user objects, and they include licenses properties, which allow you to see all of your users and the licenses that they have. And we're going to take a look at a demo of this right now. Now I'm going to show you how to monitor license allocation via the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. Okay, if I'm starting from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, this is actually in a different place. I'm going to administer this from the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. This is the first time in this course that we've seen this particular Admin Center, but we're going to come back here a lot. And what I want to do right now is just take a look at my users and groups licensing. So I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory and go and select the Licenses blade here. At this point, I can decide whether I want to see licensed features, licensing for all products, self-service sign-up. In this case, I want to see all products. Particularly, I'm interested in Office 365 E5. And here are all of my users, and I can see who they are and what licenses they have, which services have been enabled for each user, and where they got their licenses assigned. Now, notice, by the way, that a couple of folks here, Alan DeYoung and Lynn Robbins, both have direct assignments and inherited assignments via the Information Technology Group. What I can also see here is groups that have licenses assigned to them. As you can see, Information Technology has an E5 license assigned. And that's one of the places that Alan and Lynn are getting their licenses. So in other words, by nature of their membership in that group, they're getting E5 licenses along with having them directly assigned. Okay, now I just want to show you a simple example of monitoring license allocation with PowerShell. So as I already mentioned, PowerShell is just a great tool for administering Microsoft 365, and it's easy to see licensing and other information about users using the get MSOL user commandlet. So I'm going to show you what this does here. I'm going to run this script, and of course, the first thing it needs me to do is sign in as some kind of admin here. And enter my password. And then, as you can see, it just goes and it's doing something very simple. It's getting all the users, looping through, only keeping the ones where is licensed is true. So in other words, only get the licensed users, and then loop through that collection of users, writing out their sign-in name, and then echoing each of their licenses out to the console. For the record, we get these friendly names that don't necessarily map directly to the names of the products you're familiar with. So for example, Enterprise Premium means Office 365 E5. EMS Premium means Enterprise Mobility and Security E5. Of course, there's a lot more you can do with this, but this should give a flavor for it. Microsoft 365 provides a huge number of reports that report on all different aspects of the operation of your tenancy. So, for example, in the Security and Compliance Center, you can go and view auditing reports like the Office 365 Audit Log Report that shows user and admin activity, including things like changes that have been made to administrator role groups. Azure AD reports that include information about unusual or suspicious sign-in activity. Some of the more advanced functionality here requires an additional paid Azure AD subscription. And Exchange audit reports that are things like mailboxes that were accessed by people other than their owners and things like that. And then another section, DLP reports, data loss prevention reports that you can get through the Office 365 Admin Center. These are reports on things that have in some way violated DLP policies that you've configured as an admin. It allows you to go and look for things like credit card numbers and social security numbers, things that have been emailed out of the organization or that are being stored insecurely. And from the Azure AD Admin Center, you can go and view the sign-in logs that show all sign-ins, both successful and failed, conditional access, multi-factor authentication, the location where the sign-in took place, and so forth. You can also view the audit logs, which show changes to the system, including addition of users, changing role memberships, and other administrative operations. And if you have an Azure subscription, you can actually have the audit logs sent to Azure Log Analytics for further analysis. Here again, PowerShell is a really useful tool. There are a number of useful PowerShell commandlets. A couple of popular ones are get MS-OL user, which allows you to see all the users and licensing information, and get Azure AD user, which is similar, but it's in the Azure AD module, and it has less direct access to the licensing info, but it has more information about other Azure AD attributes. And get MS-OL account SKU, which has summary information about current licensing plans and the available licenses in each plan. Now we're going to see a demo of viewing sign-in logs. This is actually going to be done through Azure Active Directory. So here from the Admin Center, I'm going to start by navigating to Azure Active Directory, which as you can see is actually through the Azure portal. And once I'm here, I'll go to Azure Active Directory. And right here in the monitoring section, we can see sign-in logs and audit logs. Here are the sign-in logs. And this shows me the users that have signed in recently and the applications that they've signed into. We can also see non-interactive sign-ins here. And if I had any service principals set up or managed identities, we'd be able to see them as well currently. As you can see, we don't have any of those. For the record, we can also see audit logs here in Azure Active Directory, which is where we can see whether, for example, a sign-in succeeded or failed and other security operations that have been performed. Other reports and additional auditing information you're going to want to view in Microsoft 365 include things like the security and compliance reports that can be viewed via the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, and usage metrics that can be viewed via the usage page in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and information about service health and advisories that can be viewed via the Microsoft 365 Message Center. In many organizations, data loss prevention is an important service. DLP reports allow you to see violations of DLP policies, typically that you or other admins have created, based on templates. You can also create your own templates if you like. A common report to view is the DLP incidents report. A DLP incident is something where a policy has been triggered by some user action. DLP policies can monitor things like OneDrive, Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, Power BI, as well as on-prem repositories, and they watch for user actions like creating or sharing or transmitting files containing data that matches the policy. For example, we can see here there are a couple of files that have a series of social security numbers in them or a series of credit card numbers. And right now we're going to take a look at a demo of viewing DLP reports. This is going to be done via the Compliance Center. So here from the Admin Center, I'm going to expand and select Compliance, which brings me to the Compliance Center. Here then I can select the Reports page. And a little ways down on the Reports page, as you can see, I have the DLP incidents tile, also DLP policy matches. If I select this View Details option here, it shows me that there was one incident in Exchange. And if I want to see the details of the incident, I can select it here. And it tells me details about the thing that triggered this. In this case, it was an email with the subject line, the information you requested, sent by the username Megan B. It had 14 pieces of sensitive information in it, and so forth. So in other words, this gives me a high-level overview of all the DLP incidents that have occurred, and anything I want to know the details of, I can go and select and view it here. When something goes wrong or you need support from Microsoft, you're going to want to create a service request. This can be done directly via the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. You just go to the support section, click on New Service Request, and it gives you integrated search for Microsoft Help and then allows you to create a support ticket, which can then be monitored from the View Service Requests screen. And we're going to take a look at an example of that right now. Let's take a look now at the process of creating a new support request. Microsoft has made this really easy from here. We can go right to the support section in the admin portal and just say New Service Request, and then enter the nature of the problem. So I'm going to say Power BI not responding. And as you can see, it sort of starts out by just saying, okay, we want to go to Power Platform for this. In other words, in this case, it's redirecting me to a different admin center. So I'll sign in. And here in the Power Platform support portal, I'll go and say, okay, my problem is with Power BI Pro, and it is, we'll say it's a problem with refreshing data. Power BI not responding. In other words, first, of course, they just want us to, try to troubleshoot it ourselves. But at this point, I can say, okay, this wasn't useful. So instead, I just want to go on and say, here's my support plan, my Power Platform subscription, and then I can go and submit a request. And I won't do this right now because I don't want to trouble the actual live support people. But in fact, when I fill in this form, it will then send a support request, and I'll get added to the queue, and they'll respond appropriate to the severity of the issue. A critical planning activity in the design and implementation of your Microsoft 365 services is planning migration of your users and of your data. When you're planning your migration, you typically want to start by identifying the data that's going to be migrated. Some questions to ask include, what on-premises data is actually critical to your organization? As I mentioned before, most organizations have a lot more data on-prem than they actually need or want to keep. They just haven't bothered to clean it up. Also, what data needs to be moved from the on-prem environment to Microsoft 365 versus what data is going to remain on-prem? And importantly, where is the data currently located? For example, your migration plan is going to be very different if the data is on users' individual hard drives or if it's on a file share. Having determined what's going to be migrated, of course, you have to figure out how it's going to be migrated. One tool you might use is the SharePoint migration tool. We're going to see an example of this later on in the class. It allows for migration to SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams from on-prem instances of SharePoint or SharePoint Foundation, or from network or local file shares. You can also use PowerShell to drive the SharePoint migration tool. You might also use the OneDrive Sync client, or of course, manual upload. Another important planning process is identifying users and mailboxes that are going to be migrated. Some things to consider here include which users are actually going to need cloud-based email, if there are any regulatory or compliance concerns with any of your users' email, if there are any geographical constraints, and a couple of other important things to consider. E1 mailboxes, E1 enterprise licenses are limited to 50 gig. And then you can fit another 50 gig in the archive mailbox for each user. For E3 and E5, the limits are 100 gig for the mailboxes, but up to 1.5 terabytes for the archive mailboxes. When you're planning your migration of on-premises users and groups, it's probably common sense, but it's worth noting that when you're looking at your users, you want to identify the ones that are active and determine whether the account should be migrated. There is a bulk import process available for cloud-only deployments. You can make a CSV file of user data and upload it and have all your users automatically created. And a couple things to consider when you're creating Microsoft 365 groups. Each group can have up to 100 owners. Each user can create up to 250 groups. You can have up to 500,000 groups per tenancy. and a user can be a member of up to 1,000 groups. One group can store up to 1 terabyte of data plus 10 gig per subscribed user, and the group mailbox can be up to 50 gig in size. For migrating your mailboxes, you have a number of methods available depending on your circumstances. For a simple cutover, you can just use the cutover method. This is quick, one shot, small number of users, or you can do a minimal hybrid migration for a small number of users where you use the hybrid configuration wizard to set up a hybrid configuration and then cut over in batches if you like, or all at once. You can also do full hybrid for larger numbers of mailboxes, which gives you more control. It allows you to run both on-prem and cloud-based for a while until everything is stable. And you can also do a staged migration, which is typically reserved for older versions of Exchange. Or in the case that you have a non-Exchange mail system, for example, SendMail or Outlook.com, you can use an IMAP migration to migrate all of your user mailboxes and user data. And we'll talk more about this later in the class, but broadly, if you want to do a small number of users with a modern version of Exchange, you're likely going to do a cutover migration. If you have an older version of Exchange, you'll probably use staged. If you have a larger number of users with a modern version of Exchange, you'll probably do a remote move migration in hybrid deployment. And as I said, anything non-Exchange, you'll use IMAP. One very straightforward way of getting user mail data into Exchange Online is to import the PST files from their local workstations. This allows you to move on-prem mailboxes into Exchange Online. A feature called Intelligent Import allows you to filter what gets imported, and along with making the mail available to the users themselves, it also enables compliance by making sure that the mail is available for discovery searches in Exchange Online. You can do this over the network, or for large volumes of data, you can ship hard drives directly to Microsoft. And in order to do this, you need to download and install the PST import tools. The organization management group has to be assigned the mailbox import-export role in Exchange Online. And as part of the process, you have to generate a SAS key to enable upload to Azure Storage. If you're doing uploading, of course, if you're doing shipping, you can skip that step. Now we're going to take a look at the process of importing PST files. This is going to be done via the Exchange Admin Center. So from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, I'll go to the Exchange Admin Center. Here I have to be signed in as a member of the Exchange Admins group, which I am. And now I need to add a permission to one of the roles. Now in this case, what I'm going to do, I could create a new role with these permissions. In this case, I'm going to use the Organization Management role, which as you can see as a global admin, I already belong to. What that means is that I already have the permissions associated with this, and one of the permissions that I need is this one, mail recipients, which has already been assigned. The other one that I need is mailbox import export. So I'm going to select that and save. And now I have to wait a while, up to 24 hours. Okay, enough time has passed now, so I can continue. This is going to be done in the Compliance Center. So here from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, I'm going to go to compliance.microsoft.com, which is now Microsoft Purview. And here I'm going to go to Data Lifecycle Management and select Import. From the Import tab, I'm going to select New Import Job and give the job a name, and then click Next. And in this case, I want to upload my data. You can see we have as an option shipping hard drives to Microsoft, but in this case, I'm just going to upload it. And so in order to do this, I'm going to copy the URL that includes a key that's going to be used with Azure AZ copy. What this is doing is it's allocating a storage location temporarily that I'm going to be able to upload to, and that storage location is identified by the SAS key. So here it is. I'll copy it to the clipboard and save it for later. Now, the next step I need to do is download Azure AZ copy if I don't have it already. To do this, I'm going to click on this link, which brings me to the AZ copy page, and I can go and pick the version that I want, and then extract it someplace useful, ideally someplace in the path. And this is going to allow me to run AZ copy from a command prompt. So as you can see here in PowerShell, I'm running AZ copy with the copy command. I'm copying out everything with a .pst extension from my source folder, and I'm using the URL that was provided that includes the SAS key. As you can see, it worked. I have 2 file transfers here, and now I can go and say I'm done uploading my files and I have access to the mapping file. And click Next. So the mapping file is a file that I have to make, which is a CSV file that describes how to transfer these PST files into mailboxes in my Exchange tenant. And here are the details. The CSV mapping file is going to have columns called workload, file path, name, mailbox, is archive, and target root folder. And you can see at the bottom there, that's an example of the sample mapping file that I'm using. So I'm going to select it here. And validate it. It's correct, so I'll click Next and Submit. And then I can click Done. And now the job is going to sit here and run, and I have to wait a little while longer. And now in the process of importing, I can decide if I want to filter my data. I'm going to say, yes, I do, so I'll say Next. And I only want to import data that's less than 1 year old. And I also want to import data. You can see I can specify age here, but I can also say I only want mail from certain users. I want to exclude certain users. I only want mail to certain users or certain users in the CC field. So I'll apply all of that and then click Next and Submit. And then I can click Done. And now I'm done. My PST files have been imported into my user mailboxes. The subject of Lesson 2 is managing user identity and roles. Identity management is fundamental to every aspect of Microsoft 365. A properly configured and maintained identity management solution will allow users to seamlessly access applications and services across your Microsoft 365 deployment, while making it easier for admins to manage fundamental elements like product licensing, auditing, resource access, and role membership. Azure Active Directory is at the heart of your Microsoft cloud-based identity solution, so we'll talk a lot about Azure AD in this lesson. We'll start by talking about designing an identity strategy, including topics like determining how your users should authenticate and whether you need to synchronize your cloud identity management solution with your on-prem one. Then we'll go on to talk about some of the specifics of planning a synchronization strategy, including using the IDFix tool to review and prepare your on-prem Active Directory forest. Then we'll talk about managing a synchronization solution using either Azure AD Connect, which is an on-prem solution, or using Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, which is a lightweight cloud-based alternative. After that, we'll cover planning and managing Azure AD identities and groups, and then we'll finish with a section on managing Azure AD roles, which allow you to grant granular administrative permissions to individual users and groups. Let's get started with Lesson 2. Let's start by talking about designing an identity strategy. When you're developing a cloud identity solution, you have a number of options. You could, for example, keep all the identities in the cloud. In other words, just use your Azure AD exclusively for your authentication. But if you want to work with Azure AD in combination with your on-prem AD, you can use Azure AD password hash synchronization or Azure AD pass-through authentication, or you can use some fully federated solution. Password hash synchronization works like this. Azure AD Connect synchronizes a hash of the user's password from on-prem Active Directory to Azure AD. What this means is that the user can use the same password on-prem and in the cloud, and when they change it on-prem, it gets synchronized to the cloud. The actual password itself, of course, never gets replicated to the cloud. It's only a hash, but it's all Azure AD needs to authenticate the user. One benefit of this is that cloud authentication still works even if the on-prem links or servers go down. In pass-through authentication, the password actually stays on-prem entirely. Azure AD Connect passes the user's password hash through to the on-prem Active Directory for authentication, and so the user still uses the same password on-prem and in the cloud, but the password never leaves the premises. The password and its hash remains exclusively on-prem. This is good for security, but dependent on the availability of the on-prem resources. In other words, if the links go down or if on-prem Azure AD goes down, you can't authenticate to the cloud. So when you're determining the appropriate technology, some questions to ask include which identities need to be replicated to the cloud and how often do they need to be replicated to the cloud. Also, what properties of those identities do you want to replicate to the cloud? Of course, you're always going to replicate the user ID itself, but do you want to replicate additional things like phone number, office address, and so forth? And for the remainder of this lesson, we're going to talk about a couple of available solutions that you might use. Azure AD Connect, which runs as an on-prem service, and Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, which is largely a cloud-managed service, though it still has lightweight on-premises agents. In this section, we'll discuss planning identity synchronization. Before starting the process of configuring synchronization between your on-prem Active Directory and Azure AD, it's important to verify that your on-prem Active Directory is ready. One common problem is incompatibility between your on-prem user IDs and Azure AD user IDs because the two systems have different requirements for valid user IDs. For example, on-prem Active Directory can handle user IDs with spaces in them, whereas Azure AD can't. To make the audit and repair process easier, you can use the ID Fix tool to scan your on-prem directory and update user IDs that would otherwise cause problems with synchronization. In the next demo, I'm going to show you how to use the ID Fix tool. Okay, now we're going to take a look at using the ID Fix tool to prepare Active Directory for synchronization. So here's my domain controller, and as you can see, I have a bunch of users in here, some of whom have user IDs that are not going to be compatible with Azure Active Directory and synchronization. This is often the case if you have, for example, a first name that has spaces in it. And if we take a look at the account here, you can see that the logon name, in fact, has spaces in it, which again is not going to synchronize correctly. So to prepare for this, what I can do is I can download and install ID Fix. As you can see, I can go to microsoft.github.io/idfix and just say, install ID Fix, click on setup.exe to download the file, which I can then launch and install, and go and query the local Active Directory, which, as you can see, it just says, a little message about the schema. I can say yes, and it goes and finds all my potentially problematic users. And you can see what it's saying here. It's saying, well, this is the name and this is the class and here's the value. Here's what an update is going to do. You can see the update is just going to remove the spaces from the username. And at this point, I can say, okay, accept that. I want to go and edit all of these things. So accept all of those changes. Notice I can also say just remove them or just mark it as complete. But in this case, I'm going to say edit all of them, and then I'll go and apply. Say yes. And it goes and pushes those changes back to Active Directory so that when I query again, sure enough, nothing more shows up as a problem. And if I go back and take a look at Active Directory users and computers, this user, for example, has had its account information updated so that the logon name now has no spaces in it, which means that it's going to synchronize just fine. Now we're going to talk about managing identity synchronization with Azure Active Directory. There are a couple of options available for managing synchronization. The first is Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is descended from Microsoft Identity Manager, and it's installed to run as a service on an Azure Active Directory domain controller somewhere in your on-prem network. For every Azure AD tenant you're synchronizing, you can have exactly one instance of Azure AD Connect, though you can install a second in what's called staging mode to provide fault tolerance. Once installed, you can configure Azure AD Connect to sync multiple Active Directory forests to your Azure AD tenant. The second synchronization option is Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. With Cloud Sync, most of the configuration is done in the cloud via the Cloud Portal, and you just install one or more lightweight agents on servers in your network to manage the communication. Adding multiple agents provides high availability. And although Cloud Sync is arguably easier to set up and maintain than Azure AD Connect, it also has fewer features. So how do you choose between the two synchronization options? Primarily, you'd probably choose AD Connect in situations where you need one of the additional features it provides. For example, only AD Connect supports synchronization of custom directory attributes, pass-through authentication, and filtering by attribute values. Microsoft provides a full feature comparison as part of the Cloud Sync documentation. By contrast, although Cloud Sync has fewer features, it's also a lighter weight solution. It executes mostly in the cloud, and configuration is done entirely via the cloud. The bottom line is that since Cloud Sync is easier to manage, it's typically a good choice if you don't require the additional features provided by AD Connect. Installing Cloud Sync is a pretty straightforward process. You download the installer from the Azure portal, accept the licensing terms, sign into Azure AD, either as a global admin or as a hybrid identity admin, sign in locally as a domain admin to allow creation of the agent service account, and allow the agent configuration to complete. And now I'm going to show you a quick demo of this process. Now we're going to take a look at installing and configuring Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. And before getting into this, there are a couple of prerequisites that have to be met. I have to be signed in the on-prem domain as an enterprise or domain admin. I have to be at least a hybrid identity admin in Azure AD. In this case, I'm a global admin, which will do the same thing. My on-prem server has to be at least Windows 2016. I have to have .NET Framework 4.7.1. And my on-prem firewall has to allow ports 80, 443, and 8080. And I have to enable outbound rules that allow traffic to msappproxy.net and servicebus.windows.net. So now I'm going to get started, but I want to show you the sort of current configuration of my environment. Right now, here I am in Azure Active Directory. And as you can see, I have some users, but not that many. And here's my on-prem Active Directory. You can see currently I have, well, in fact, let's take a look here. I have 353 users, groups, and contacts in here. And what I want to do now is synchronize all of these folks to Azure Active Directory. So in order to do that, I'm here in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory and select Azure AD Connect. Here under Azure AD Connect, I'm going to select Manage Azure AD Cloud Sync and go to Review All Agents. So currently I don't have any agents installed, so that's the first thing that I have to do. I'm going to download an on-premises agent, accept the terms and download, and once the download is complete, I'll launch the file. Of course, agree to the license terms and conditions and click Install. And here we go. I'm in the agent configuration wizard now, so I'm going to click Next. I'll sign into Azure AD, of course. And then in my on-prem Active Directory, I have to set up a managed service account. I might already have one configured, but in this case, I'm going to let the wizard configure one for me. And that means that all I have to do here is provide the credentials for an on-prem admin. Now I'm going to connect to Active Directory. In this case, I have exactly one directory for us to connect to. I'll confirm the connection. And now the agent is installed and restarted, so I can exit the installer. And at this point, my agent should be visible in Active Directory. So I can go back to Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, review all agents. There's my agent. It's currently inactive, so I'm going to wait for it to wake up. Okay. Now my agent is active, and that means that now I can set up a configuration. So now I'm going to add a new configuration. So yes, adatum.com is the directory that I want to sync. I do want to enable password hash sync. That's going to allow password hashes to be replicated between on-prem and the cloud, which will make this more robust. And now I'll say create. Okay, so my configuration's been created, and I can now edit it here. I'm going to do something really simple. In this case, for example, I don't want to add any scoping to my users. I'm just going to say I want to sync everybody. But as you can see, I could decide to sync only certain security groups, only certain OUs. In this case, I'm just going to say, let's sync everybody. And I can also edit attribute mappings. The attributes for on-prem Active Directory, of course, are not identical to the ones for Azure AD. So we have a bunch of default mappings here. And again, I could go and edit these if I want to. I'm going to leave them the way they are for now. Okay, next we have a validation step, and I'm going to provision a user just to make sure this is all working. I have a user here called Tara. I'm entering her fully qualified name here, and I'm going to say provision. As you can see, this has worked. She's been provisioned, and all the attributes have been mapped the way that I
expected them to be. So I can say, finish this up and do the last of my settings. So I'm the person that should be notified if something goes wrong. And we want to enable this so that it'll work, and then I'll go ahead and save. And my configuration is now in place and apparently healthy, which means that now I have synchronization going on. Now, at this point, I can go and check the logs and make sure that everything is working okay here. So far, the only things I see are tests that I've run. But what I'll start to see after a while is evidence that synchronization is working. And so at this point, I should be able to go back to Azure AD. And what I'll start to see is my users filling in. Now, right now, you can see there's Tara, who I just synchronized. We'll come back in a while now and make sure that this has all worked. Okay, and a little time has passed now. Not much time, by the way, about 10 minutes. And if I check the logs now, we can see that, sure enough, there's stuff going on. So it's starting to synchronize. And if I go and visit Azure AD and look at the users, in fact, I have a lot more users here than I used to. In fact, you can see that all of these things are very clearly coming from on-prem. Also, notice none of them currently have licenses. So they're currently all being synchronized, but none of them can do anything. So that's going to be a separate exercise. If you plan to use Azure AD Connect for directory synchronization, you should start by verifying that your system meets the following prerequisites. You have to install AD Connect on a domain-joined Windows server, version 2016 or later. The server has to have a full GUI. Server core is not supported. If multi-factor authentication is enabled, the URL you see on the slide has to be in your trusted sites list. You have to log in as an account that is an Azure AD Global Admin for the target tenant. DNS resolution has to be correctly configured for both the internet and the intranet. And you have to have PowerShell version 5 and .NET Framework 4.5.1. To install Azure AD Connect, you just go to the Active Users page in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center and select Directory Synchronization from the ellipsis menu. This kicks off a download of the installer, and then when the download is complete, you run the setup application and follow the prompts. A lot of the setup process is fairly cut and dried, and I'll show you a demo of the process in a bit, but there are a number of optional configurations available. For example, Exchange Hybrid Deployment. This is for situations where you have an Office 365 deployment with mailboxes hosted both on-premises and in the cloud. Password Synchronization. This synchronizes a hash of the user's on-prem password with Azure AD. When the user authenticates to Azure AD, the password they enter is hashed using the same process, and if the hashes match, the user is authenticated. Each time the user updates their password on premises, the updated password hash synchronizes to Azure AD. Password Writeback. This option lets users change their passwords in the cloud and have the changed password synced back to the on-prem Active Directory instance. Group Writeback. This causes changes to Azure AD groups to be written back to the on-premises AD instance. Object filters are another thing you can configure with Azure AD Connect. Object filters allow you to selectively sync only parts of your on-prem Active Directory. Object filters can be group-based, where you only synchronize the contents of a single group. This is usually used for testing or pilot projects. They can also be domain-based, where you only choose certain domains from your forest to sync. You can also choose to sync only certain OUs, and you can also filter on specific attribute values and only sync domain objects that match your attribute filter. When you configure password synchronization, Azure AD Connect doesn't sync the actual clear text passwords. Instead, it extracts the on-prem password hashes, hashes the hashes, and then copies them to Azure AD. This runs every 2 minutes, and it provides availability if your on-prem links fail. Here's a high-level block diagram of the password hash sync process. Every 2 minutes, the password hash synchronization agent on the AD Connect server requests the password hashes, which is the Unicode p-word attribute, from a domain controller, using the same protocol domain controllers use to exchange hashes. This means that the service account must have the replicate directory changes and replicate directory changes all Active Directory permissions, which are granted by default during the install of AD Connect. The domain controller encrypts the hashes and sends them to the agent. The agent then decrypts the message from the domain controller so that it has the original password hashes,
not the clear text passwords. It then hashes the hashes. The resulting hashes are then sent to Azure AD. When a user wants to sign into Azure AD, they enter their password, and the password is run through the same multi-hashing process. If the resulting hash matches the hash stored in Azure AD, the user has entered the correct password and is authenticated. You can only have one AD Connect server per tenant. However, it can connect to multiple forests. This brings up another potential concern. What if a user has an account in more than one forest? Azure AD uses a flat namespace, so each user should only have one account. To accommodate this, the setup application lets you define rules about how to uniquely identify them. The default setting is to assume that all users are only represented once in all forests and no special action is taken. Other options allow you to combine user accounts across forests based on the mail attribute, the object SID, and MS Exchange master account SID attributes, the SAM account name and mail nickname attributes, or on attributes that you specify. Okay, now we're going to take a look at installing and configuring Azure AD Connect. There are a few ways to do this, but an easy way of doing it is right here from the Admin Center. I can go and look at the active users view. And over here, we've got a link for directory synchronization, which will take me to the Download Center, where I can download the Azure Active Directory Connect tool. And once it downloads, I'll go ahead and launch it. Okay, here we go. Launching the installer. And now I can set up Azure AD Connect. So I'm going to agree to the license terms and continue. I could use Express settings, but I'm going to customize this. And so I have a number of options. I'm not going to choose any of them right now, but I can, for example, pick an alternate location for the installation. I can use a specific instance of SQL Server rather than installing SQL Express, use an existing service account, specify custom sync groups, or import settings from a previous setup. I'm not going to do any of those. I'm just going to go ahead and install. Okay, and now I can configure user sign in. And in this case, as you can see, we've got options. So I could choose password hash synchronization, which is what I'm going to use. This, of course, just means sync the password hashes between Active Directory and local and Azure Active Directory. But we could also do pass-through authentication, where cloud sign-ins are forwarded to the local Active Directory. Federation with ADFS, if I have that installed. Federation with Ping Federate, which is a third-party service you can federate with if you like. Or, of course, not configure. And we can say we want to allow desktop users to access cloud services without re-authenticating, which I will turn on here. And now I'll click Next. And now I just need some valid global admin account. And now that I'm signed into Azure AD, I do the local configuration. So in this case, we are using just this forest, adatum.com. And that means that I now need a forest account. I need an enterprise admin to do that. So I'll sign in as one. Okay, and what's the on-prem attribute we're going to use is the Azure AD username. In this case, I'm just going to use the user principal name. You can see we've got a lot of options here, but I'm going to stick with this one. And we'll also say discontinue without matching all UPN suffixes to verified domains. And click Next. Okay, what do I want to sync? I'm just going to say everything, but again, I could, of course, decide that I only want certain OUs, but again, we're just going to do all of them. And because my users are in OUs, this is a place where the namespaces between on-prem Active Directory and Azure AD might not match up. And so this is how do we disambiguate them? In other words, if I have two users whose names collide, how do we distinguish them? In this case, we're just going to say, you know, I happen to know all my users are only represented once across all directories, and this isn't going to be a problem. Of course, if it was, well, then I could choose some way of distinguishing them across OUs or whatever other containers they're in. But in this case, we're just going to say once across all directories, and they're going to be identified in Azure AD based on an algorithm that Azure is going to apply. Okay, we just want to synchronize everybody.
And then, of course, I could, again, choose additional features. I'm not going to do any of that right now, but for example, we could do an Exchange hybrid deployment, which we'll talk about later, and Exchange mail public folders, Azure AD app and attribute filtering. Again, we could say, certain things are going to be filtered out. I could enable password write back. So if someone changes their password in the cloud, it gets written back to the local AD and so forth. But we'll leave all that the way it is. And I do want to enable single sign-on, so I need a domain admin account to configure that. And I'm ready to go. So I want to start the sync process when configuration completes. And I'm just going to go ahead and install. And that's it. My configuration is complete. And at this point, I can assume that synchronization is running. I can now go and check and verify that my users have been synchronized to Azure Active Directory, and then go on and do additional configuration.
Azure AD Connect is instrumented and includes components to allow for ongoing monitoring. This allows you to identify sync errors and monitor the health of the agent. There are also standalone agents that allow monitoring of Active Directory Federation services and Active Directory domain services, and this can all be done in one place via the Azure AD Connect Health Portal. Once Azure AD Connect has been installed, you can rerun the configuration wizard at any time to manage its configuration. This allows you to maintain and make changes to features like device writeback, group writeback, and custom synchronization options, change the service account information, reset trust relationships, set up federation, and a number of other settings and features. Lesson 2.4, Manage Azure AD Identities. When planning your Azure AD identities, the first thing to consider is how your environment will be configured. In hybrid environments, most of the identity management will be done in the on-prem Active Directory. In cloud environments, identity management might be done via the Microsoft 365 Admin Center or the Azure AD Admin Center, or you might use the Azure CLI or PowerShell, or some combination or any or all of these methods. Other questions include, what will your UPNs look like? You'll need a naming convention that includes a default domain, which can be any domain that's been configured and authorized to use with the directory. What will your organization want to require for authentication and authorization? For example, what's your password change policy? Will you require multi-factor authentication? What user roles will you define, and what are the membership rules? And the same question for Azure AD groups. As previously mentioned, Azure AD users can be managed in a number of ways, but for the most common kinds of user management, it's common to use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. From here, you can manage things like the username and password, the user's personal information, their group membership, and Microsoft 365 product licensing. Although the Microsoft 365 Admin Center is simpler, the Azure AD Admin Center provides a richer set of options. From here, you can perform tasks like updating the user's profile information, assigning directory roles, managing the user's group memberships, licensing and device authorization, as well as managing access to Azure resources, authentication methods, and quite a lot more. The admin centers are useful for one-off interactive identity management, but for bulk operations, PowerShell is a great option. The Azure AD module provides dozens of powerful, intuitive commandlets to permit repeatable, scalable management of Azure AD. For example, the slide shows a few of the popular commandlets for user management. You can use scripts to create, view, and delete user objects, to edit their properties and group memberships, manage passwords, and much, much more. Here's a simple example, a one-liner that lists out all of the users in the directory, showing each user's first name, last name, and user principal name. Of course, managing passwords is one of the most common administrative operations, and Microsoft 365 and Azure AD provide a number of ways to do it. If you reset the user's password interactively via the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you have the options of either generating a password automatically or using your own, requiring the user to change the password the first time they sign in, and having the initial sign-in information emailed to you. Of course, you can also reset a user's password via PowerShell using the set MS-100 user password commandlet. Here, you can specify the new password and whether or not the user will be required to change it the first time they sign on. If it's aligned with your organization's policies, you can cut down on calls to the help desk by enabling self-service password reset. This is done via the Azure Active Directory portal by navigating to the user's blade, selecting Password Reset, and switching the Self-Service Password Reset Enabled setting to All. The effect of enabling self-service password reset is that users are given the option of resetting their own passwords by going to https://passwordreset.microsoftonline.com and completing a basic form. Unsurprisingly, Azure AD logs extensively. As an admin, you can use the sign-in logs to view successful and failed sign-ins for all users, and you can view the audit logs to see what various accounts have been doing in Azure AD. Microsoft 365 defines several kinds of groups. Microsoft 365 groups are designed to support collaboration. Each Microsoft 365 group has its own email address, a shared workspace, and shared locations for files and calendar events, and a planner. Security groups, on the other hand, are much simpler. They're designed solely for the purpose of granting access to resources. Security groups can contain both user accounts and device accounts. Another aspect of group membership in Azure AD is that it can be assigned or dynamic. Assigned simply means static group membership. An admin has to manually place a user into a group. Dynamic membership means that a user's membership in a group is based on a query against the user's attributes. A user whose attributes match the query automatically becomes a member of the group. Both kinds of membership can be configured and managed by the Microsoft 365 Admin Portal, the Azure AD Admin Portal, or via PowerShell. Just like with user management, the Azure AD PowerShell module provides commandlets for creating, viewing, and deleting groups and managing their membership. The slide shows just a few of the common commandlets that allow for repeatable, script-based management of groups and group membership. Microsoft 365 product licenses can be viewed and assigned via the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. From the Active Users page, you can select a user and then view that user's Licenses and Apps page to see which products that user is licensed for. Licensing information can also be managed with PowerShell. For example, the get MSOL user commandlet retrieves product licensing as part of the user data it returns. The image on the screen shows an example where the results of the get MSOL user commandlet are filtered for only licensed users, and then for each user, their sign-in name is written to the console, their licenses are enumerated, and each license SKU is written to the console. Now we're going to talk about managing user roles in Azure AD. To support flexibility in assigning permissions, Microsoft 365 defines a large number of administrative roles, all of which are documented at the URL on the slide. At the time this course was developed, this article defined 81 different roles. Obviously, it would be tedious to list out all of the roles and their permissions here, but there are a few particularly important roles that are worth mentioning. Billing administrators can purchase and manage subscriptions and can also manage support tickets and monitor service health. Compliance administrators can manage features in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, Microsoft 365 Admin Center, Azure, and Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center. Global Administrator, Company Administrator is the everything role. This role provides administrative access to all Azure AD features. Guest inviters can manage Azure AD B2B guest user invitations. Information Protection Administrators can manage all aspects of Azure Information Protection, including configuring labels, managing protection templates, and activating protection. Password administrators and help desk administrators can change passwords, invalidate refresh tokens, manage service requests, and monitor service health, but only for non-administrative users. Power BI administrators have admin permissions over Power BI. Report readers can view reporting data in the Microsoft 365 Reports dashboard. Security administrators have admin-level access to manage security features in the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center, Azure AD Identity Protection, and Azure Information Protection. Security readers have global read-only access to security-related features, including all information in Microsoft 365 Security Center, Azure Active Directory, Identity Protection, Privileged Identity Management, as well as the ability to read Azure Active Directory sign-in reports and audit logs, and in Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. Service support administrators can open and view support requests for Microsoft 365-related services, and Teams administrators can administer all elements of Microsoft Teams. In addition to the task-specific roles, a number of roles are tied to specific workloads. For example, Exchange, Intune, and SharePoint all have dedicated roles with the appropriate permissions to administer them. Time for Lesson 3. The focus of this lesson is managing access and authentication. Once you've set up Azure AD, you've got the infrastructure and services you need to secure and manage access to Microsoft 365 applications and services. Although Azure Active Directory is secure by default, you can put additional measures in place to accommodate your organization's specific requirements, which is a lot of what we're talking about in this lesson. We'll start with managing authentication, which includes topics like deciding whether or not to use multi-factor authentication, setting up password management policies, and monitoring authentication events. Then we'll cover planning and implementing secure access, which involves putting additional measures in place to securely manage unusual or potentially risky user sign-in behavior. And finally, we'll talk about configuring application access, which refers to using Azure AD to secure third-party and on-prem applications. Let's go. We'll start by covering management of authentication. Obviously, authentication is a critical part of any secure Microsoft 365 deployment, and there are a number of important decisions to make when you're configuring your tenant. One option for Exchange Online authentication is to use basic authentication, which simply involves requiring the user to enter a username and password. However, in the current security climate, it's strongly recommended that you consider using modern authentication. This adds additional layers of security by enabling the use of multi-factor authentication, smart card authentication, certificate-based authentication, and so forth. If you choose modern authentication, you'll have to determine which additional verification methods you want to support. For example, entering a code texted to the user's mobile phone, or using the Microsoft Authenticator app. Along with configuring modern or basic authentication for Exchange Online, other things to consider for configuring authentication include configuring security defaults for Azure AD, which mandates multi-factor authentication tenant-wide, and establishing a password policy, specifying a number of days before user passwords expire and the number of days before a user is notified of imminent password expiration. In Azure AD, you can configure one or more authentication methods for scenarios where you want to require more than just a password. Your options include asking a user to provide a security key, use the Microsoft Authenticator app, enter a code that's texted to their phone, or use a temporary access pass, which is a time-limited passcode that an admin provides when a user has lost access to their primary authentication method. It's considered a best practice to configure more than one of these methods. Let's look at a few more features you can configure when managing authentication. Azure AD Smart Lockout, Azure AD Banned Passwords, Self-Service Password Reset, Passwordless Phone Sign-On, and Certificate-Based Azure AD Authentication. Azure Active Directory Smart Lockout helps protect against brute force style password attacks by locking the account after a configurable number of failed sign-in attempts. The defaults are to lock it for 60 seconds after 10 failed attempts. This is all configured via the Azure AD Admin Center. Azure Active Directory banned passwords are a neat feature. You can use this feature to hard code a list of passwords that are not allowed, for example, the word password or your company name. There's also a simple validation algorithm that blocks weak variants and combinations. For example, if your company name is Contoso, the algorithm also blocks passwords that substitute zeros for the O's in the word. Self-Service Password Reset allows users to reset their own passwords by way of a special portal using alternative authentication methods. This is configured in Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and you can configure it so Self-Service Password Reset is available to none of your users, which is the default, certain groups of your users, or everyone in your organization. This is a great feature which makes users' lives easier while reducing the volume of help desk calls. Passwordless Phone Sign-On, as the name implies, allows users to authenticate without any password at all. Instead, they use the Microsoft Authenticator app. One special note is that the app can only be registered with a single tenant for this to work. Also, users must be enrolled for multi-factor authentication. You can enable it via the Azure Active Directory admin portal, and then users can register via the My Sign-ins portal at aka.ms MySecurityInfo. As an admin, of course you're going to want to monitor authentication in your tenancy. And as we've already mentioned, sign-ins and audit log reports show normal activity. However, the risky sign-ins and risky users reports, which are part of Azure Identity Protection, show suspicious activity. Risk in this context is an amalgam of a number of different factors, and the type of evaluation varies depending on whether you have Azure AD Free, Premium P1, or Premium P2. Also, the exact mechanism will evolve over time as Microsoft continues to respond to new online threats, but some common types of threats include things like atypical or impossible travel, password spray attacks, evidence that credentials have been leaked, or sign-in attempts from anonymous, malicious, or malware-associated IP addresses. When conditional access rules are met, they can trigger a wide variety of policies. Some common policies include requiring multi-factor authentication for sign-ins that are flagged as risky or unusual, responding to accounts that show characteristics of having been compromised, requiring that a sign-in be conducted from a managed device in order to succeed, requiring the use of approved client applications, and blocking access entirely if warranted. When configuring conditional access, the conditions being evaluated are referred to as signals. Some common signals include the user who's logging in or groups they're a member of, IP location information, which if desired can be used to block or allow the IP ranges for entire countries or regions, characteristics of the device that the user is logging in with, the application that the user wishes to use, real-time calculated risk detection, where Azure AD can identify risky sign-in behavior and then require users to change their password or do multi-factor authentication, or can just block access altogether, and Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, which enables user activity to be monitored and controlled in real time. Once a signal has been detected, you can configure your policy to take one or more actions. Some common ones are block access, which is the most restrictive decision, or grant access, which is the least restrictive decision, but you can still require additional constraints, like requiring multi-factor authentication, requiring the device to be marked as compliant, requiring that the device be a hybrid Azure joined device, which means that it's joined to your on-prem AD and also registered with Azure AD, requiring that the client app has been approved in advance, or requiring enforcement of an Intune app protection policy, which governs what an app is allowed to do with corporate data. Azure AD Entitlement Management lets you automate access requests, resource assignments, and reviews and expirations of resource allocations. Entitlement access packages contain groups of resources and associated permissions, allowing them to be managed in bundles. The resources can be teams and groups, applications, or SharePoint Online sites. The access packages can be admin assigned, or you can permit self-service access requests. And this functionality requires that you have a premium P2 license. Now I'm going to show you a quick demo of this.
Time to take a look at the process of creating an access package. This is going to be done in Azure Active Directory, so I'm going to start by going to the Azure AD Admin Center. And from here, I'll go to Azure Active Directory, to Identity Governance, and here I'm going to take a look at access packages and say that I want to make a new access package. So in this case, I want to do something simple. I just want to allow people to access a particular team and a related SharePoint site. So if I look in Teams right now, so you have a team here called Continuous Improvement Team, and I just want to allow people to request access to it if they want it. So I'm going to call this Continuous Improvement. So I'll give it a name and a description. I'm going to save it in the general catalog. Catalogs are sort of security containers if you have multiple groups of admins that want to create different sets of access packages. But in this case, I'm just going to put it in the general catalog. And I'm going to say now that this package is going to give access to the Continuous Improvement Team. Here it is. So I'll select that. And also the Continuous Improvement Team SharePoint site right here. So just those two things, that's what we're requesting access to. And specifically, what I want them to request access to is to be a member of the Continuous Improvement Team and a member of the Continuous Improvement Team SharePoint site. Next, we want to say who can request access and what the requests are going to look like. So in this case, I want users in my directory, and I'm just going to say everyone. So everyone can request access. It does require approval, and they have to justify their reason for wanting the access. I'm going to say there's just one stage of approval, and their manager is the default approver. But I will add fallback. I'll say that that demo admin is a backup approver. And I want to enable new requests and then go to requester information. And at this point, I'm going to just add a couple of questions that I want to ask people when they're making the request. So first, I'm just going to say, allow them to give a short text answer to why they want access to these resources, and then specifically ask them what continuous improvement methodology they're using. And I'm going to say they can choose from Kaizen and Six Sigma. Okay, and this access package currently is going to be set to expire in 1 year, 365 days. You can see we could set it to other things, but I'm just going to say this access, once granted, will last for 365 days, and the user can also request a specific timeline if they need something different. We will not require access reviews, nor will I apply any rules, so I don't need any custom extensions or anything like that. We could see add flows to run if, when a request is created or something, but in this case, I'm just going to say, we'll go ahead and create this. Okay. And there it is. My access package has been successfully created. Now, at this point, what this means is that when a user wants to request access to those particular resources, they want to use this access package, they can go to the My Access portal link. So let's demonstrate that now. Okay, so I'm signed into Office as a different user, as a user named Alan. And if we look right now, you can see that Alan is not a member of that team. He's not a member of the continuous improvement team. So what Alan can do is he can go to myaccess.microsoft.com, and it brings him to things he can request access to. And here are our access packages. So he can say, okay, I want to request access to continuous improvement. And here are my questions. He has to say, why do you want access to these resources? And he has to give a reason. And here's the multiple choice. He can request for a specific period, but we're going to leave it with the default. And he can now submit his access request. Okay. His request has been submitted now. And so now I'm signed in as a different user. I'm signed in as Alan's boss, Nestor. And Nestor has now received an email that says approve or deny a request. So he can now click approve or deny request, which takes him to myaccess.microsoft.com. Here's Alan's request, which he can see the details of course. He can go and see the things that Alan filled in. And having reviewed it, he can now approve and say, looks good. Welcome to the team. So now switching back to Alan's profile, when he goes and looks at his request history, you can see that here's the request that he put in and the date that it was requested. And you can go see that, in fact, his boss approved it, which means that now he can go back to Teams here. We'll go ahead and refresh. And you can see that now, sure enough, he is now a member of the continuous improvement team.
Microsoft analyzes trillions of signals per day to identify new and existing threats that can compromise users' identities and other sensitive data. This ongoing analysis has been used to develop identity protection, which allows organizations to accomplish 3 key tasks: automate detection and remediation of identity-based risks, investigate risks using the portal, and export risk detection data to your security information and event management system. New sign-in risk factors are identified all the time, but some common ones include sign-ins that originate from anonymous IP addresses, impossible travel sign-ins, like when a user signs in from New York at 9 p.m. and then the same user signs in from Stockholm at 9:07 p.m., indicating that the identity has probably been compromised, sign-in from malware-associated IP addresses, sign-ins using credentials that have been observed in data from known security breaches, and password spray attacks, which are a type of brute force attack where a compromised list of usernames is combined with common passwords in an effort to mitigate the type of lockouts that occur when an attempt is made at brute forcing the password for a single account. Identity protection is configured via the Azure AD admin portal by selecting Identity Protection from the Security Getting Started blade in the Protect section of the portal. As with many of the other features we've discussed here, this will only be available if you have a premium P2 subscription. The user risk policy is one of the components of identity protection. This can be assigned to individual users or all users. The risk level that triggers policy is a likelihood that the account is compromised, with likelihood being defined by a number of factors that may change over time. When the policy is triggered, you can choose to block access, or enable access but require the user to change their password. Another policy that's available with identity protection is sign-in risk. This can also be assigned to individual users or all of them, and the risk level that triggers the policy is a likelihood that the sign-in is coming from someone other than the user, once again based on a set of conditions that may evolve over time. Here too, you can decide to block access, or enable access with a password change requirement. Members of the Global Administrator and Security Administrator roles have full administrative access to identity protection. Security operators can perform typical help desk operations such as dismissing user risk events and confirming safe sign-ins, and security readers can view identity protection reports such as the risky sign-ins report that you see at the bottom of the slide. When an identity protection policy is triggered, the user will receive a message like the one you see here. Depending on the configuration and the severity of the event, the user may need to call the help desk to have their sign-in unblocked. As previously discussed, conditional access allows you to control the conditions under which a user can successfully sign in. Implementing a conditional access policy requires that you have an Azure AD Premium P1 license. You begin by navigating to the Azure AD Admin Center, selecting the security blade, and selecting Conditional Access. You then create a new policy, assign users in groups to the policy, assign conditions, for example sign-in risk, and then specify what you want the policy to do when triggered: block access, or grant access with additional requirements. Now to illustrate, I'm going to do a demo of this process.
Now we're going to take a look at creating a conditional access policy in Azure Active Directory. This is going to be done in Azure AD, so from the Admin Center, I'm going to go to the Active Directory Admin Center and sign in. Go to Azure AD and go to the Security Blade, and from here I'm going to select Conditional Access and create a new conditional access policy. Now in this case, I'm going to do something pretty simple. I'm just going to say that for certain apps, if the sign-in is risky, I want to require multi-factor authentication, so I'm just going to give it a descriptive name here. Okay. And I want to apply this to everybody. Notice, by the way, that it's saying don't lock yourself out. This policy will affect all users. So in other words, make sure that you don't accidentally do something that prevents you from signing in. This is going to include me. I could, of course, say everybody except for, somebody. But in this case, I'm actually just going to say everybody. And now I want to apply this to specific cloud apps. In this case, I want to apply it to the Office 365 app itself, and also to the Power BI service. So just those two. And next, I'll pick the conditions that I want to trigger the policy on. And in this case, you can see I have, if it's a particular platform, a particular location. In this case, what I want is if the sign-in risk is high or medium. Now, risk is, of course, something that's kind of dynamically determined. And the folks at Microsoft are always kind of evolving the algorithm that's used to determine this. But in this case, I'm just saying whatever the current definition of high or medium is, that's what we're going to trigger on. And then here's what I want to happen as the result of this policy being triggered. So if a risky sign-in is detected, I want to grant access, but I want to require multi-factor authentication. So in other words, in the event that this condition occurs, we are not going to block access. We want to grant access, but we want to require multi-factor authentication. And I'm going to, as a best practice, I'm going to leave this in report-only mode for now. In other words, this is just let the policy be enforced, and I can go and check and verify that it's being enforced, but it's not actually causing the MFA yet. It's just, I'm just going to see that the policy is being applied the way I expect it to be. So currently it's report only. And once the policy has been in place and it's doing what I want it to do, then I can switch it over and say, okay, start enforcing it.
Once your conditional access policies have been created, you can manage them via the conditional access dashboard and monitor them via sign-in logs. When you want to allow users from an organization outside of your own to access resources or perform operations inside of your Microsoft 365 tenancy, you can create B2B accounts for them. B2B accounts are a special type of guest user account that allow users from partner orgs to access Microsoft 365 resources. With B2B accounts, the account information is stored in a separate tenancy and represented in your tenancy as a guest user. Configuring B2B accounts establishes a trust relationship with the external Azure AD tenant, enabling the external system to authenticate the account. And now I'm going to demonstrate how to set up a B2B account.
Now we're going to take a look at creating a B2B account in Azure Active Directory. Although this is done through Azure AD, I can start from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center and go to the Guest Users page and say I want to add a guest user. At this point, as you can see, it switches me into the Azure AD Admin Center. And I'm going to say I want to invite a user, so I'm going to invite a new guest user. And in this case, I'm going to invite a user named Adele. Note that this is a separate tenant from the one that I'm creating this in, so this is someone from a different Microsoft tenant. And now I'm going to invite her. Invitation has been issued. So now I'll switch over to Adele's account and we'll take a look at the invitation that she's received. So here you can see I'm signed in as Adele in this other tenant, and if I go take a look at her inbox, sure enough, there's an invitation here from MOD administrator, and it gives a little warning saying, this is, make sure you trust this domain, make sure you trust this person. I'm just going to accept the invitation. And it asks her to, say it's okay for the trust relationship to be set up, because this, in fact, does require some sharing of information between Adele's tenant and the Contoso tenant, and specifically, name, email address, photo. So she's going to accept. And here we are. Now, right now, she doesn't have any access to actual resources in my organization. So I'm going to switch back over to the Contoso tenant now that her guest user has been added, and give her a little bit of access and see the effect. So back here now in the Contoso admin portal, sure enough, here's Adele's user. And although she shows as having her email address in the guest tenant, she does actually have a proper address here in the Contoso tenant. And that means that now if I have a team here that I want to add her to, I can say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and add her as a member. As you can see, she does show up as a guest in my directory. I can go ahead and add her. She's now a guest member of the team. And that means I can switch back over to Adele's account again. And here in Adele's inbox, you can see that she's gotten a message that she's joined that she's been added to the team. And if she goes to Teams, so we'll go to Teams as Adele here. Currently, see, she's just looking at the Teams in her current tenancy, but she can switch, see, to her Contoso guest user. And sure enough, there's the joint task force team, and she can participate in it as a guest.
Now we're going to talk about configuring application access. Application registration is how you can enable your users to use their Microsoft 365 credentials to access software as a service applications from third-party vendors. Only members of the Global Administrator, Cloud Application Administrator, or Application Administrator roles can configure application registration. It's managed by the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and to get you started, you can choose an app from the gallery or create your own. Now I'm going to show you an example of registering a third-party application.
So now we're going to take a look at adding a third-party app to Azure AD. And this can take a lot of different forms, but I'm going to do something pretty fundamental. I'm going to add Amazon AWS to use single sign-on with Azure AD. So in other words, I want to use Azure AD as my identity provider for Amazon AWS. And so in order to do this, I'm going to go and find the AWS single sign-on service here in the Azure AD gallery and go ahead and create it. And now I have some back and forth to do. I'm going to start by assigning some users and groups, and specifically I'm going to add myself. Use this. And now I have to configure single sign-on, and I'm going to say I want to use SAML, and I'm going to edit my basic SAML configuration. And as you can see, what I need to do now is fill in things like an entity ID and sign-in URL and things like that. Those are all things I can do manually, but what I'm going to do instead is go and enable it on the AWS side and get a metadata file that I'm going to upload. So here I am in the AWS Management Console. I'm signed in as an admin who can configure this stuff in AWS. So I'm going to go to AWS Single Sign-On, which I have already enabled, and I'm going to choose my identity source. Now, in this case, my identity source is currently, you can see, configured to use AWS SSO. In other words, it's built-in single sign-on. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to say I want to use an external identity provider and click Next. And this provides me with my download, as you can see, for my metadata file. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to download my service provider metadata, which I will keep. And now switching back over to Azure AD, I'll upload my metadata file. So I'll go ahead and browse and select that file. Here it is. And as you can see, that fills in all my information. So it gives me my entity ID and reply URL and all the stuff that I need. So I'll go ahead and save that. Okay, so I'm going to test this later. I want to do a little bit more configuring here now, because now what I want to do is do it the other way around. So now I want to set up AWS single sign-on. So I'll go ahead and click on this, which will allow me to download a federation file, see here, and switch over to AWS SSO. So see, I'm still on this page for configuring my external identity provider. So now I can go and choose that file that I just downloaded from AWS. Okay, and now I'm going to say, yep, I'm going to review and confirm. So I need to type accept here and change the identity source. Okay. So now I've changed my identity source. Now at this point, I could go and start manually configuring users, but what I want to do instead is enable automatic provisioning. So what I can say is when I provision users in Azure AD, I want to be able to automatically provision them here as well. So I'm going to enable that. And what I need to do now is do a little more configuration. So I need to copy this URL, which is the endpoint that Azure AD is going to use. So I'm going to copy that and just make a note of it elsewhere. And then I have to get my access token and make a note of that as well, because as you can see here, it's only going to give me access to it once. Once I close this, it'll be gone. So I need to make sure that I've got both of these things logged. And now I'm going to close this up and switch back over to Azure AD again. And here in Azure AD, I'm going to switch now to the provisioning blade and get started here and set my provisioning mode to automatic. And this is where I need that URL and that token from AWS. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. Here's the token. Test my connection and make sure that, yep, I'm able to do that, which I am. Okay, and now as you can see, it's going to allow me to provision both Azure AD groups and Azure AD users dynamically and send an email notification if I want. But I'm going to leave this the way that it is. And we'll go back now and try it out. So I'm going to go ahead and test this. And in fact, I was successful. So I was able to use my Azure AD identity to successfully get a token from AWS. So that means that now I can use Azure AD as my identity provider for all of my AWS applications.
If you need to provide cloud-based access to an on-prem application, you can configure an application proxy. This means there's no need to update your on-prem applications. With an application proxy, your on-prem applications can use Azure AD authentication controls, security analytics, multi-factor authentication, conditional access policies, and more. Application proxy does not require inbound ports to be opened on your organization's perimeter firewall, nor does it require on-prem deployment of additional appliances. Here's a high-level overview of how the application proxy works. The user accesses the application through an endpoint and is directed to the Azure AD sign-in page. Upon successful sign-in, Azure AD sends a token to the user's client device. The client then sends the token to the application proxy service, which retrieves the user principal name and security principal name from the token. The application proxy then sends the request to the application proxy connector. If SSO is configured, then the connector performs any additional authentication required on behalf of the user. The connector sends the request to the on-premises application, and a response is returned through the connector and application proxy service to the user. To configure an application proxy, you start by selecting Application Proxy in the Azure AD portal, clicking Download Connector Service, running the install wizard, and then verifying that the services are running. It's time now for our final lesson, Lesson 4, which is about planning Office 365 workloads and applications. With a solid administrative and identity management framework in place, we can now start talking about deploying applications and services into your Microsoft 365 tenant. We'll start by talking about planning for deployment of the standard Microsoft 365 apps like Word Online, Excel Online, OneDrive, OneNote, and so on, with an eye to assessing existing on-prem assets and planning for a successful migration to the cloud. Next, we'll look at planning for messaging deployments. We'll review a number of possible strategies for migrating on-prem email solutions, either partly or fully, to Exchange Online and Outlook Online. Then we'll talk about planning for Microsoft SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, including what's involved in migrating on-premises file storage to a cloud-based solution. Then we'll discuss planning for Microsoft Teams infrastructure, both for team management and voice communication. And we'll finish with a discussion of planning Microsoft Power Platform integration and what's involved in preparing your organization for low-code, no-code development. Let's get started. First, we're going to talk about planning for Microsoft 365 apps deployment. For reasons that are probably obvious, network bandwidth usage typically goes up with Microsoft 365 deployments. To accommodate this, one best practice is to configure firewalls to limit overhead for connections to Microsoft content delivery networks, for example by skipping packet inspection and other more resource-intensive security measures. Microsoft maintains an up-to-date list of all of their CDN's IP addresses at the URL you see on the screen. The list is formatted as JSON data, making it easier for admins to develop automated solutions that get their data from this URL. The Office Deployment Tool, or ODT, can also help with connectivity management because it allows you to install or update the Office applications either from local network shares or from the Microsoft CDN. The ODT is a command line tool that gives you finer-grained, scriptable control over your Office installations. You can use a config file like the one you see here to control things like the products that are installed and the languages in which they are installed, and what the update strategy will be, and all of this can be done silently if desired so the users remain unaware of the installation. Most modern organizations rely on their employees having significant levels of access to content and functionality via their mobile devices. To support this requirement, Word, Excel, Outlook, PowerPoint, Teams, OneDrive, and OneNote are all available from both iOS and Android. If desired, all of these applications can be installed directly from the appropriate app store for the user's platform, or they can be pushed to user devices via Intune, which provides better management in bring-your-own-device environments. Office Online is Microsoft's cloud-based Office suite. Although the cloud applications are not as complex or expressive as their desktop counterparts, Office Online provides basic functionality for a variety of Microsoft Office applications through a supported web browser. The implication for admins is that Office Online has the potential to change user workflows, potentially reducing the need for desktop-installed applications. Desktop Analytics is a cloud-based service that integrates with Configuration Manager as part of Microsoft 365's Endpoint Manager solution. The purpose of Desktop Analytics is to assess application risk. The risk in question here is the risk that an application will not work as expected after an organizational upgrade to Microsoft 365. The risk levels are low, meaning that the application is likely to work after the upgrade; medium, meaning that the application may have some impaired functionality after the upgrade, though remediation may be possible; high, meaning that the application is unlikely to function after the upgrade; and unknown, meaning that the application was not assessed and no determination can be made. To do its job, Desktop Analytics uses the Microsoft App Compatibility Database to identify known issues. It can also analyze application health status, measuring indicators like % of devices with crashes, which is the number of devices where a specific application has crashed in the last 14 days, as a percentage of the total number of devices on which the app is installed. Mean time to failure, which is the average elapsed time between application crashes on each device over the past 14 days. Active devices, which is the number of devices where a user launched a specific app within the past 14 days. And total usage duration, which is the total time that the specified app has been used during the past 14 days. Setup of Desktop Analytics is done via the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Setting it up requires licenses of Configuration Manager and either Windows 10 Enterprise E3 or E5, Education A3 or A5, or Virtual Desktop Access E3 or E5. And here's an example of a Desktop Analytics report. It provides a visual representation of the state of the devices and applications in your organization. It's also worth noting that Desktop Analytics is itself nearing end of life. In the future, its features will be incorporated directly into the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Another thing to assess when preparing to deploy Office 365 into your organization is the state of any current Office-based solutions with an eye to features that could lead to loss of function when you deploy. For example, if your organization uses any business-critical Visual Basic for applications, macros, and add-ins, they might not be compatible with the current version of Microsoft 365 apps. You can use the Readiness Toolkit for Office add-ins and VBA to identify compatibility issues. It's free to download at the URL you see on the screen, and next I'm going to show you a quick example of how it works.
Now we're going to take a look at using the Readiness Toolkit. So I've downloaded and installed the most recent version of the Readiness Toolkit for Office add-ins and VBA, and I'm currently pointing it at a directory here called Office Documents that just has a bunch of Word and Excel documents in it. I want to generate an Excel report as opposed to a SQL Server report. I don't want to conceal the file names and paths. I do want to scan everything for Silverlight or Flash controls because, of course, that's becoming more and more of an issue as those things have been deprecated and might represent security concerns. I want to do an advanced report where I'm including VBA macro remediation advice, and now I'm going to create the report. It now goes and scans the directory. It ultimately finds 310 documents, it should be anyway, by the time it... Yep, and then it sits there and analyzes, and now it'll generate my report. And my demo glitched right at the end there, but I did get a report. So this is what the final screen of the Readiness Toolkit would look like normally, and it gives you the option of opening the report in Excel. Here's what the final report looked like. So here's the main page of the report. You can see it says that 306 documents were processed. Of those 306, 300 didn't have any macros. 3 couldn't be analyzed. 3 have VBA macros, and I can now go and look at the VBA readiness report to see the details. As you can see, currently I don't have anything too much to worry about here. I have 3 unique macros that were detected. And if I go and take a look at the VBA summary, it shows the documents that contain the macros, and also has some things that are sort of labeled the severity of the potential problem. If I look at the VBA results page, it tells me like here are things that couldn't be accessed, and then everything else it just says, if we look at the guidelines here, everything else is just no issues detected. So there were a few things that couldn't be accessed, a couple of things that had VBA in them, and nothing else to worry about. If I had anything with concerns, it would show up here on the VBA remediation page with potential solutions for whatever is wrong with the VBA macros that were detected.
One administrative decision that should be made early is whether or not users are permitted to do self-service installations of the Office applications, and which ones they can install. This configuration is done in the Microsoft 365 admin portal under Org Settings. The admin can decide which apps should be available for installation, and there are separate settings for Windows and Mac machines. Another thing to determine is the schedule on which users get their Office applications updated. The default is that they get updates as soon as they're ready. This is the recommended option, and it ensures that users always have the most current versions of everything, but they might get more than one update per week and there's no set schedule. If your organization would prefer a more predictable schedule and fewer updates, you can choose to receive updates once a month, and your updates will arrive on the second Tuesday of every month. And for cases where your organization requires extensive testing before updates are deployed, the semi-annual enterprise channel pushes updates on the second Tuesday of January and the second Tuesday of July. Office Telemetry is a compatibility monitoring framework that is built into Office 2013, 2016, 2019, and 365. The Telemetry Dashboard is a special Excel workbook that provides configuration and viewing of Office Telemetry components. The Telemetry Dashboard includes instructions and links to set up monitoring, which configures a database and system components. Once configured, the Telemetry Dashboard provides reporting on inventory, usage, and health data about the Office documents and solutions used in your organization. Now we're going to talk about planning for messaging deployments. One of the first questions to address when planning a new Microsoft 365 messaging deployment is where the solution will be implemented. One option is cloud only. In this scenario, all user mailboxes are hosted in Azure data centers through Exchange Online, and the admin has no on-premises messaging infrastructure to deploy or manage. Another possibility is Exchange Hybrid. In this case, some mailboxes are hosted on-premises on an Exchange server deployment, while other mailboxes are hosted in Exchange Online. This can be beneficial for certain usage profiles, for example in cases with limited bandwidth or sporadic connectivity. A baseline prerequisite for any messaging deployment is to verify network connectivity, which includes ensuring that the correct ports are open on your firewalls. The bottom line is that in most scenarios, both online and on-prem components will require access to TCP ports 25 and 443. All Internet-enabled mail requires configuration of MX records in the organization's DNS. MX records can be set up to point to Exchange Online, on-prem, or intermediate SMTP servers. Microsoft recommends that you configure your MX records to point to Exchange Online protection in Microsoft 365. This is because it allows you to take advantage of Microsoft's services that filter spam, malware, and other undesirable mail traffic. For a DNS domain to work with your Exchange tenant, it must be set up as an accepted domain with appropriately configured MX records. There are two types of accepted domain. Authoritative domains are the normal kind. With authoritative domains, incoming email will be delivered to email addresses that are configured for recipients for this domain. Email to unknown recipients will be rejected. This configuration is appropriate as long as all recipients are using Microsoft 365 or your organization's own email servers. With relay domains, email is delivered using a Mailflow connector to another mail server. Exchange will not generate bounce messages if a recipient doesn't exist. This kind of solution is appropriate if some members of your organization are not using Microsoft 365, and in cases where mail must be forwarded to mail servers that you don't control. There are certain factors that will heavily influence your choices when planning a strategy for migrating to Exchange Online. For example, recall from earlier in the course that there are different strategies available for different circumstances. Each migration strategy has its pluses and minuses. Cutover migrations are appropriate for migrating small numbers of mailboxes to a purely cloud-based solution. Staged migrations can be used for migrating small numbers of Exchange 2007 or 2010 mailboxes. Staged migrations can also be used for larger numbers of Exchange 2007 or 2010 mailboxes in a hybrid scenario, as can remote move migrations in hybrid deployment. Remote move migrations in hybrid deployment are also applicable to migrating later editions of Exchange, and IMAP migrations are intended for migrating non-Exchange on-premises messaging systems. An Exchange hybrid deployment is where an on-prem Exchange environment coexists with Exchange Online. In this kind of environment, user accounts are managed using on-premises tools. Directory synchronization is used to connect the on-premises Exchange organization with Exchange Online. Users can use single sign-on to access their mailbox whether the mailbox is hosted on-premises or online. Email is routed securely between the on-premises Exchange deployment and Exchange Online. And free busy calendar sharing is available for users with mailboxes hosted in the on-premises Exchange organization and mailboxes hosted in Exchange Online. To implement a hybrid deployment, there are some basic requirements. For an Exchange 2010 hybrid deployment, you must have at least one Exchange 2010 server with the mailbox, hub transport, and client access server roles installed, and your auto-discover public DNS records must point to the on-premises client access server. For an Exchange 2013 hybrid deployment, you must have at least one server with the mailbox and client access roles installed, and your auto-discover public DNS records must point to the on-premises client access server. And for an Exchange 2016 or 2019 hybrid deployment, you must have at least one server with the mailbox server role installed, and your auto-discover public DNS records must point at the on-premises mailbox server. In addition to the previously mentioned requirements, hybrid deployments require that Azure AD Connect must be configured to sync on-prem AD to Azure AD. Any custom domains must be registered with your Azure AD tenancy. Your Microsoft 365 organization must be connected to the Exchange Admin Center, and any IIS instances on your Exchange servers must have valid digital certificates configured. In a cutover migration, all on-prem mailboxes are migrated to Exchange Online in a single batch. This type of migration is suitable when all mailboxes will be hosted in Microsoft 365. User accounts will be managed using Microsoft 365 tools. The migration should be performed in less than 1 week. The organization has fewer than 2,000 mailboxes. Your on-premises messaging solution is Exchange Server 2007 or later, which will hopefully not be a concern since Exchange Server 2007 reached end of extended support on April 11, 2017. And the primary domain name used for on-premises Exchange deployment can be configured as a domain associated with a Microsoft 365 tenancy. Here's a high-level summary of the steps involved in doing a cutover migration. Start by creating empty mail-enabled security groups in Microsoft 365. Then create a migration endpoint. And then you're ready to create and start a cutover migration batch using the Exchange Admin Center or Windows PowerShell. When the batch is triggered, Exchange Online then queries the on-premises Exchange deployment's address book to identify mailboxes, distribution groups, and contacts, provisions new Exchange Online mailboxes, creates distribution groups and contacts within Exchange Online, migrates mailbox data from each on-premises mailbox to the corresponding Exchange Online mailbox, and then forwards the administrator a report providing statistics, including the number of successful and failed migrations. At this point, incremental synchronization will occur every 24 hours, updating Exchange Online with any new items created in the on-premises mailboxes. Once you verify that this process worked, you can change the MX records to point to Exchange Online, delete the cutover migration batch, which terminates synchronization between the on-premises mailboxes and Microsoft 365, and then perform post-migration tasks, including assigning Microsoft 365 licenses, creating an auto-discover DNS record, and decommissioning your on-premises Exchange servers. A minimal hybrid or express migration keeps on-prem and online mailboxes in sync during migration. This kind of migration is appropriate when your on-prem install is Exchange 2010 or later, your migration timetable is less than a few weeks, and when no ongoing directory service configuration is intended. Here's a high-level overview of the minimal hybrid or express migration process. First, in the Microsoft 365 console, you add the domain used by your on-premises Exchange organization by configuring a DNS-TXT record. Then sign into Microsoft 365 as a global administrator and start the Exchange Hybrid Configuration Wizard from the Data Migration page under Setup in the Microsoft 365 Admin Console. Connect to the on-premises Exchange server organization. Choose the Minimal Hybrid Configuration option. Select the option to synchronize users and passwords one at a time. At this point, you will be prompted to install Azure AD Connect with the default options, and then synchronization will occur once and then be turned off. Configure Microsoft 365 licenses for migrated users, and then begin migrating user mailbox data, and finally, update DNS MX records to point away from the on-premises Exchange deployment to Exchange Online. The remote move migration method has been used with existing hybrid deployments to move mailboxes from on-prem to Exchange Online. To use this kind of process, a hybrid deployment must already exist between your on-premises Exchange organization and Exchange Online. It must be performed by an account that has the organization management or recipient management role, and the mailbox replication proxy service must be deployed on all on-premises Exchange 2013 or Exchange 2016 client access servers. And here's a high-level overview of the remote move migration method. You start by creating a migration endpoint. Migration endpoints host connection settings for on-prem Exchange servers that are running the MRS proxy service. Then you enable the MRS proxy service, which is hosted on on-prem client access servers, then move the mailboxes. This can be done via the Office 365 tab in EAC on the on-premises Exchange server by creating a new migration batch in Exchange Admin Console or with PowerShell. Mailboxes are moved in groups called batches. Then remove the completed migration batches using the Exchange Administration Center or Windows PowerShell, and re-enable offline access for the Outlook web app. If users have been migrated from on-premises Exchange server to Office 365, offline access settings must be re-enabled in their browser. In a staged migration, you migrate mailboxes from your on-prem Exchange servers to Exchange Online in groups. Staged migrations are appropriate when there are more than 2,000 mailboxes on-prem in Exchange 2003 or 2007. The plan is to cut over completely to Exchange Online. The time frame is several or more weeks. After the migration, the plan is for user accounts to be managed on-prem and synced with Azure AD, and the primary on-prem domain is configured as a domain in Microsoft 365. And here's a high-level summary of the staged migration method. Start by creating one CSV file per batch with a row for every user to be migrated. Then, create a staged migration batch using the Exchange Admin Center or PowerShell. Trigger the migration batch. Exchange Online will then verify that directory synchronization is enabled and functioning, verify that a mail-enabled user exists in Office 365 for every user in the CSV file, convert each user in the file from an Office 365 mail-enabled user to an Exchange Online mailbox, configure mail forwarding for the on-premises mailbox, and Exchange Online then sends a status report. Then convert the mailboxes of successfully migrated on-premises users to mail-enabled users in the on-premises Exchange deployment, configure a new batch of users to migrate and delete the current batch, and after all users have been migrated, assign licenses to Office 365 users, configure MX records to point to Exchange Online, and create an auto-discover record that points to Office 365. Finally, decommission the on-premises Exchange deployment. IMAP migrations use the IMAP protocol to move mailbox data. These are suitable for non-Exchange mail systems such as Courier IMAP, Cyrus, Dovecot, and UW IMAP. It's also useful for online systems like Outlook.com. Here's a high-level summary of an IMAP migration. You start by creating Microsoft 365 user accounts and assigning them Exchange Online user licenses. This must be completed by a tenant administrator. Then create a CSV file that includes a row for each on-premises user who will be migrated to Exchange Online using IMAP. This must also be completed by a tenant administrator. Create and trigger an IMAP migration batch using the migration dashboard. Once the migration batch is initiated, Exchange Online does the following. Creates a migration request for each user in the CSV file, copies messages from each user's IMAP mailbox to the corresponding Exchange Online mailbox until all data is migrated, provides a status email to the administrator informing them of the status of the migration. Exchange Online and the IMAP messaging system are synchronized every 24 hours to move any new messages from the on-premises environment to Exchange Online. Once all batches have been processed, update the MX records to point to Exchange Online, and finally, delete the migration batches. In this section, we're going to talk about planning for SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. When you're migrating to Microsoft 365, you have to determine how you're going to move your on-premises data to the cloud. For example, you may have on-premises file shares that you want to migrate to SharePoint or OneDrive, or you may have an on-premises SharePoint farm that you want to fully or partly move into SharePoint Online. You have several options available to you. The simplest one is just to manually upload everything. This is appropriate for small ad hoc migrations, but if you want to migrate larger amounts of data in a more structured manner, you can install the OneDrive Sync client and push out policies to redirect some or all of your users' Windows known folders to OneDrive. Or you can use the SharePoint migration tool, which provides more control and flexibility and allows you to migrate a number of different kinds of file stores. Using the SharePoint migration tool is pretty straightforward. It's a small free download, and once installed, you can use it to migrate from on-prem SharePoint or file shares interactively, and you can also perform bulk migrations using JSON or CSV files that describe what to migrate. Now I'm going to show you a demonstration of how the tool works.
Okay, let's take a look at using the SharePoint migration tool to migrate some file share data into SharePoint Online. So here's my setup. I have a SharePoint Online site with a document library that I've called Public Documents. It currently doesn't contain anything. And I have a simulated public file share here with a bunch of folders with files in them. And I've downloaded the SharePoint migration tool, so I'm going to sign into it now. This has now launched the SharePoint migration tool, and I'm going to say I want to start a new migration. And in this case, I want to copy content from a file share, and I'll go ahead and add my directory path in here. And I want to migrate selected folder and folder content. So now I'll say I want to copy content to SharePoint, and specifically I want to copy to Contoso Intranet here, and my public documents library that I just created. I'll click Next. Okay. Now I could at this point just perform scanning. So in other words, I could tell it just go and tell me what's going to be involved in doing the migration. In this case, I'm confident that it's going to work, so I'll leave it that way. I do want to preserve permissions. So in other words, I want to keep any permissions that have been set on my file share, along with migrating file version history and doing automatic user mapping. So again, this assumes that my user principal names on-prem can be mapped uniformly to my cloud-based ones. In this case, I happen to know they can be. Additional things I might do is create manual user mappings with a file, which I won't do right now. Keep all versions, include hidden files, and so forth. I'm going to leave that the way that it is and select Migrate. And there we go. My migration is complete, and about 50,000 files in about 25 minutes. I can now go and view the reports here and see how it all went, but I'm going to go ahead and save this first, and then go and check on how it all went. So first, let's take a look at the summary report. And here it is. So you can see it shows the total transfer, all the information about when it started, when it ended. And if we go back now and take a look at the other reports, here's the performance report. Let's take a look at this in Excel. So you can see very detailed information about which files were migrated, how long it took to migrate them, how much data they contain. So this, among other things, gives you a full audit of the entire process. And of course, I can also go and just check on the results. So here in the intranet side, I can now check the public documents library and see that I now have a new public folder that contains all of my user data folders, and within each folder, all the files for that folder, and of course, their contents.
Planning how external sharing can be done in your organization is a critically important administrative decision that should be made early to avoid user confusion. Anyone who's ever used OneDrive knows that it's extremely easy to share content stored in OneDrive with external users, which is great in terms of usability and potentially worrying to organizations that want to safeguard their sensitive data. The external sharing settings in SharePoint and OneDrive gives the admin a good amount of control over how content gets shared, so admins can decide who should be allowed to share what and how. Sharing settings are configured via the SharePoint Admin Center and allow you to permit sharing to anyone, new and existing guests, only existing guests, or only internal users, along with a number of additional refinements. SharePoint site admins can also manage how sharing works at the site level. Admins can go to the Settings menu and select Site Permissions. From there, they can select Site Sharing. There, in addition to configuring who is permitted to share files, folders, and the entire site, they can also allow users without permissions to request access and specify who the email goes to when a request is made. Although the topic of Azure Active Directory groups is in no way unique to SharePoint, planning for Azure AD groups is a critical part of planning a SharePoint deployment. Generically, Azure AD groups organize users, but there are a couple of types of group. Security groups are just for managing security, that is, organizing users who require similar resource permissions. Microsoft 365 groups imply creation of other assets, for example, distribution lists, teams, and even SharePoint sites. Conversely, creating SharePoint Online team sites also creates Microsoft 365 groups with the same membership. The SharePoint Admin Center allows configuration and management of many other settings. For example, SharePoint admins can control how users are notified about SharePoint activity, whether or not users can create new pages, the default settings for new sites, and much more. In this section, we're going to look at planning for a Microsoft Teams infrastructure. As you may know, Teams is more or less ubiquitous in modern Microsoft 365 environments. It is enabled by default for all Microsoft 365 tenants. If desired, you can selectively disable it, either via the Microsoft 365 Admin Center or by using PowerShell. Otherwise, it's available to all of your users. Your primary point of administration is the Teams Admin Center, which provides tenant-wide policy-based configuration. To help you get started, the Teams Advisor tool can help guide creation of appropriate policies and configurations. It's accessible in the Admin Center by expanding the Planning category and selecting Teams Advisor. Although many organizations use it exclusively for messaging and online collaboration, Teams can also support voice communication, either entirely in software or integrated with specialized telephony hardware. If you plan to use Teams in this way, the Teams Admin Center includes a set of tools for managing voice communication. The Call Quality Dashboard provides a network-wide view of call quality. Call Analytics allows you to monitor and troubleshoot call and meeting quality for individual users, and Teams can also allow you to insert quality of service markers into real-time traffic so that your other network components can prioritize it. If you want to allow Teams to manage all of your organization's telephony, you can deploy Microsoft 365 Teams Phone System, which provides a full software-based private branch exchange system. Using the Teams Admin Center, you can configure auto attendance, call queues, voicemail, and so forth. Phone System connects to the public switch telephone network either via the Microsoft Calling Plan service, which lets you connect to the PSTN network using Microsoft's cloud infrastructure, or via your existing telephony infrastructure. Access to Teams is not limited to users from within your own Microsoft 365 tenancy. If members of your organization want to use Teams to collaborate with members of partner organizations, you can grant guest access to users from other Azure AD tenancies or users with Microsoft accounts. Adding a guest to a team is a straightforward process. A team owner, or someone with Microsoft 365 admin privileges, adds a guest to a team, specifying the guest's Microsoft 365 email account address or third-party email address. The guest receives a welcome email. If the guest has a Microsoft 365 work or school account, they can accept the invitation and authenticate directly. Users with third-party email addresses are sent a one-time passcode to validate their identity. Teams is built from the ground up to be extensible. Team members can use connectors to integrate Teams with external services. A channel can be set up to get feeds from RSS feeds, Trello, GitHub, DevOps, Google Analytics, and dozens of other services. For our final topic, we're going to talk about Power Platform integration. The Power Platform is a set of applications and tools that enable cloud-based, low-code, no-code development at scale. Power BI is the business analytics component, enabling analysis of enterprise data from almost any data source. Power Apps enable citizen developers to develop, deploy, and maintain apps without the support of traditional application developers. Power Automate enables automation of business processes across services, both on-premises and in the cloud. And Power Virtual Agents allow creation of intelligent virtual agents. The Power Platform is supported by a common framework that includes data connectors, which allow Power Apps and Power Automate to connect to hundreds of different services, AI Builder, which provides facilities for creating powerful AI solutions that can then be incorporated into Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate, and Dataverse, which is a specialized database that is available to all Power Platform solutions. As powerful as the Power Platform is, deploying it into your enterprise can be a daunting proposition. To help support the deployment process, Microsoft has created the Power Platform Center of Excellence Starter Kit. This is a collection of components and tools designed to help you develop your strategy for adopting and supporting the Power Platform. It focuses specifically on Power Apps, Power Automate, and Power Virtual Agents. It's implemented as a collection of documentation and solutions and is downloadable from the URL you see on the slide. One thing to note is that it requires a fairly involved setup process, so be sure to budget enough time. Once it's been deployed, the COE Starter Kit includes a collection of apps, flows, and a Power BI dashboard that collect and display information from across your Power Platform environment. For admins, managing environments is an important aspect of deploying and maintaining a healthy Power Platform deployment. A Power Platform environment is an administrative boundary and container for Power Platform assets. Each environment is defined in a single geographic region, and you can only have one Dataverse database per environment. Environments are created and managed via the Power Platform Admin Center. To create a new environment, you need to be a global admin, a Dynamics 365 admin, or a Power Platform admin. Despite its relative simplicity and accessibility, the Power Platform requires substantial planning to ensure a successful deployment. The factors admins have to consider when planning a deployment include governance policies that account for the fact that each Power Platform environment is provisioned in a specific geographic region, identifying an appropriate application and data lifecycle management strategy, planning for environments to support both development and production workloads, data loss prevention policies that protect sensitive information from leaking out of the organization, ensuring that administrative privileges are assigned appropriately, and planning around the constraints that each environment can have exactly one Dataverse database and that resources in one environment cannot access resources in another environment. When planning for Power Platform resource deployments, it's strongly recommended that you create separate test and production environments for apps, flows, and chatbots. Developers can then test apps thoroughly before releasing them. Other factors to consider in environment planning include the fact that each environment is tied to a single Azure AD tenant and is only accessible from users in that tenant, and that apps created in an environment can only connect to data sources in that environment, and that resources can be moved between environments. Generally, Power Apps and Power Automate flows will connect to external services. Apps and flows can connect to hundreds of cloud services with the appropriate credentials, and no further configuration will be required. If you want to connect to on-premises services, such as in-house databases or other on-prem applications, that's possible, but it requires the deployment of an on-premises gateway, which is a small piece of software that uses the Azure Service Bus to bridge between your on-prem resources and the Microsoft Cloud. Power Platform admins have a number of responsibilities, including management of resources. The Resources node in the Power Platform Admin Center allows management of capacity, which gives an overview of where your tenant is using storage, add-ons, and API requests that could impact your capacity. Dynamics 365 apps, which permits management of any Dynamics 365 apps purchased through Microsoft AppSource. And Portals, where you manage data-driven websites that have been created using Power Apps techniques. Thanks again for choosing this video training course. This has been MS-100, Microsoft 365 Identity and Services. I hope you've enjoyed the course, and I wish you well as you deploy and implement Microsoft 365.